Before the thunder, there was only the quiet turning of the season. It began not with a roar, but with the soft shutting of front doors in quiet villages across the English countryside. Boys who had barely learned to shave, whose hands were still accustomed to the weight of a cricket bat or the smooth wood of a baker's paddle, were stepping out into the morning mist. They carried with them the smell of their mothers' kitchens, the lingering warmth of a final cup of tea, and the unspoken hopes of the people who watched them walk down the cobblestone lanes. The train stations were filled with a gentle hum, a murmur of voices trying to be brave. It was not a scene of panic, but of a quiet, nervous anticipation. Suitcases were traded for canvas packs, heavy and strange against young shoulders. Stiff wool uniforms, smelling faintly of the factory and mothballs, replaced Sunday suits and soft cotton work shirts. Mothers adjusted collars that did not need adjusting, letting their hands linger just a moment longer on the shoulders of their sons. Fathers gave firm nods, their eyes holding a complicated mixture of pride and a quiet, hidden dread. As the trains pulled away, slowly gaining speed, the boys leaned out the windows, waving until the figures on the platform became blurs of color, and then, simply memories. Through the glass, the rolling green hills of home slipped by. They watched the familiar patchwork of fields, the grazing sheep, the old stone bridges, painting a picture in their minds that many were committing to memory for the very first time. They were sons, brothers, and sweethearts, leaving the only world they had ever known, pulled by the gentle gravity of a duty they barely understood. To many, in those early days, it felt less like a descent into the dark and more like a great, mysterious excursion. When they finally crossed the water and arrived in France, the land greeted them not with the harsh realities they had imagined, but with the warm, gentle embrace of a continental spring. The skies above them were a vast, untroubled blue, dotted only by the lazy drift of white clouds. The air was incredibly sweet, carrying the scent of damp earth, blooming apple orchards, and wildflowers hiding in the tall grass. They found themselves billeted in sleepy farmhouses, quiet barns, and open meadows, where the loudest sounds were the lowing of cattle and the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. This was the strange, suspended time that would come to be known as the Phony War. It was a war that seemed to exist only on paper, a conflict of waiting and watching, where the expected storm stubbornly refused to break. The young soldiers, far from the dramatic front lines of their vivid imaginations, found themselves largely fighting off the slow creep of boredom. They dug trenches in the soft earth, yes, but they often paused, leaning on their spades to watch a butterfly land on the freshly turned soil. They strung coils of barbed wire across green fields that still looked entirely meant for grazing horses. The landscape itself seemed blissfully unaware of the darkness gathering at the unseen edges of the map. Nature carried on with her soft, ancient routines, lulling the men into a sense of false, beautiful security. They mingled gently with the local villagers, bridging the gap of language with shy smiles and hesitant gestures. An old French woman in a black shawl might offer a warm, crusty loaf of bread to a red-cheeked boy from Yorkshire, seeing in his eyes the reflection of a grandson she worried for. A farmer might pause his plow to watch the young men march awkwardly down a country lane, offering a quiet nod of solidarity. The soldiers traded cigarettes for fresh milk, and in the quiet afternoons, they would sit by the stone walls of the village squares, basking in the sun like sleepy cats, feeling entirely disconnected from the concept of danger. In this gentle delay, a profound and quiet camaraderie began to bloom among the canvas tents and the dusty haylofts. Strangers from vastly different corners of the country found themselves suddenly sharing the exact same small universe. A quiet clerk from the busy streets of London and a sturdy fisherman from the rocky coast of Cornwall learned the rhythms of each other's breathing in the dark. They learned who talked in their sleep, who held on to a quiet, unspoken sadness, and who could always be relied upon for a gentle joke when the evening stretched out a little too long. They sat in small circles on the soft spring grass, passing around dented tin mugs of lukewarm tea, letting the metal warm their palms. They taught each other card games, betting with matchsticks and spare buttons, their laughter rising into the twilight, light and carefree. They learned to mend holes in heavy wool socks with clumsy, determined fingers, trading stories of the homes they had left behind. They spoke of the girls they hoped were waiting, of the specific way the light hit their hometown streets at dusk, of the dogs that used to sleep at the foot of their beds. In these slow, empty hours, the heavy military uniforms seemed to fade away, revealing the ordinary, gentle hearts beating steadily beneath the khaki. They were not yet warriors, they were simply young men, finding comfort in the shared warmth of an unfamiliar world. As the days melted softly into weeks, the evenings became a sacred time for the most intimate of rituals. When the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the French sky in strokes of peach, lavender, and gold, the camp would quiet down. Men would find a solitary corner, propped against a sun-warmed farmhouse wall, sitting on an overturned wooden crate, or lying flat on their stomachs in the fragrant clover. They would pull out dog-eared pads of paper, stubby pencils, or leaking fountain pens, their faces softening in deep concentration. The letters they wrote in the fading light were rarely about the grand, sweeping strategies of nations or the mechanics of an army. They were about the small, grounding details that tethered their floating hearts to their past lives. They wrote about the weather, marveling at how the spring rain here felt just the same as the rain falling on their own roofs back home. They asked about the family garden, inquiring if the tomatoes had been planted yet, or if the back gate had finally been fixed. They asked about the neighbors, the local football scores, the health of younger siblings. With quiet heroism, they carefully omitted the coldness of the nights spent on the ground and the strange, quiet anxieties that sometimes crept into their minds when the camp was still. Instead, they filled the pages with gentle reassurances. "I am eating wonderfully," they wrote. "The weather is uncommonly fine. Do not worry for me, Mother, I am perfectly safe." They folded these fragile pieces of their hearts into thin envelopes, trusting them to journey back across the water, invisible lifelines stretching across the sea. The smell of the paper, the scratch of the graphite, these were profound acts of love, quiet defiances against the vast, unknown space that separated them from everything they held dear. They sealed the envelopes with a kiss or a lingering touch, handing them over to the post-corporal with a silent prayer for their safe arrival. When the letters were collected and the final light of the day gave way to twilight, the camps would settle into a profound, heavy silence. The stars above the French countryside emerged brilliant and cold, scattered like diamond dust across the velvet black of the night sky. Sentries stood at the edge of the sleeping fields, their breath pluming faintly in the crisp night air, listening to the soft rustle of the wind through the high branches. They were watching for an enemy that seemed more like a ghost, a rumor whispered across a distant border, rather than anything real or tangible. Inside the tents and barns, the men slept deeply, wrapped tightly in their wool blankets, their faces slack, peaceful, and incredibly youthful in the pale moonlight. They dreamed of the cobblestone streets, the warm bakeries, the familiar voices of their fathers, and the sweethearts waiting by the garden gates. There was a beautiful, fragile innocence to this slumber, a collective suspension of disbelief. They were cocooned in the soft, golden light of a spring that felt as though it might last forever. It was a time of waiting, of breathing in the sweet air, of looking at the stars and feeling a quiet kinship with the man sleeping simply an arm's length away. The world had paused, holding its breath in the meadows of France. Yet, if one listened very, very closely to the wind, past the rhythmic breathing of the sleeping boys and the creaking of the old wooden farmhouses, there was the subtlest shift in the air. A sudden coolness that carried the faintest, most distant vibration. It was not enough to wake them, not yet. It was only a shadow, stretching slowly, almost imperceptibly, across the spring grass. The men slept on, dreaming their gentle, hopeful dreams, wrapped in the quiet camaraderie of the twilight, entirely unaware that the peaceful world they had known was taking its very last, soft breath. The morning broke not with the familiar call of a meadowlark, but with a deep, unnatural trembling beneath the soft spring grass. It was a vibration felt first in the soles of the boots, a low and steady murmur that seemed to rise from the very bones of the earth. In the quiet barns and the sunlit farmhouses where the boys had slept so peacefully, dust began to dance in the shafts of morning light. Cups of pale tea, held in relaxed hands, suddenly rippled with tiny, anxious waves. The men stopped their quiet banter. They stood still, listening, as the distant horizon began to hum with the weight of something vast and entirely unknown. The gentle pause of the season had finally shattered, replaced by a sweeping tide that would change the shape of their world forever. When they stepped out into the morning, the sky they had so often gazed upon with homesick eyes was fundamentally changed. The vast, untroubled blue of the French spring was now torn open, streaked with dark, unnatural clouds that stretched like long fingers across the sun. A heavy sound, like a swarm of angry, metallic bees, filled the upper atmosphere. It was an overwhelming realization that the peace they had been resting in was merely an illusion, a fragile pane of glass that had just been quietly, irreparably broken. The orders that came trickling down the lanes were not the grand, heroic commands they might have imagined in their boyhood dreams. There were no trumpets, no forward charges across open green fields. Instead, there was a hushed, hurried confusion. The orders were simply to pack up, to turn around, to fall back. The boys moved with a strange, dreamlike urgency. They folded their heavy wool blankets, their hands shaking just a little, rolling them tightly against the sudden chill of reality. They slung their rifles over their shoulders, the wood and metal suddenly feeling much heavier than it had the day before. They looked back at the haylofts and the stone walls that had sheltered them, feeling a profound, inexplicable sorrow at leaving these borrowed homes. In the span of a single morning, they were no longer simply waiting, they were retreating from an invisible, approaching storm. As they began to march back down the winding country roads, the landscape itself seemed to mourn the loss of innocence. They passed through the very villages where they had traded shy smiles and simple pleasantries just days before. Now, the cobblestone squares were eerily silent. The bakeries were empty, the ovens gone cold. Doors were left swinging open in the gentle breeze, revealing the intimate, hastily abandoned lives within. A young soldier from the Midlands paused by a small, whitewashed cottage. On the wooden porch, a child's rag doll lay abandoned, its button eyes staring up at the changing sky. Through an open window, he could see a kitchen table still set for breakfast, a half-sliced loaf of bread resting on a wooden board. He felt a sudden, heavy ache in his chest, a quiet apology rising in his throat for the people he could not protect, for the safety he could not provide. He gently picked up the doll, setting it carefully on a windowsill, a small, futile gesture of respect in the face of an overwhelming tide. The roads, once empty and serene, quickly became choked with a slow, agonizing procession. It was not just the soldiers who were falling back. The villagers, the farmers, the old women in black shawls, and the children clutching small wooden toys were all pouring out of their homes, joining the great, uncertain migration toward the west. They pushed heavy wooden handcarts piled high with whatever pieces of their lives they could carry, a folded quilt, a brass clock, a portrait of a grandfather. The boys in uniform walked alongside them, their heads bowed against the rising dust. The dust was everywhere, a pale, chalky powder that coated their boots, settled in the creases of their uniforms, and turned their youthful faces into pale masks of exhaustion. The air grew thick and heavy, the sweet scent of apple blossoms replaced by the dry, metallic smell of moving machinery and fear. In the midst of this sorrowful march, small, quiet moments of humanity bloomed like wildflowers in the dust. A tall, broad-shouldered sergeant, whose voice was usually a rough bark, gently lifted a crying toddler into his arms, carrying the child for miles while the exhausted mother leaned heavily against his side. A quiet farm boy from Scotland, realizing his water canteen was still half full, unscrewed the cap and offered it to an elderly man leading a tired, sway-backed horse. The man took a small, grateful sip, his eyes meeting the soldiers in a silent, profound understanding. There were no words needed, only the shared, quiet resilience of holding on to one another in the dark. As the days blurred into a continuous, exhausting rhythm of walking, the boys found themselves changing. The soft, rounded edges of their youth were slowly being worn away by the miles and the uncertainty. They learned to sleep while standing during momentary halts, leaning against trees or simply against each other, a forest of weary boys propping up the sky. Their pockets, once filled with hopeful letters waiting to be posted, were now empty. There was no time to sit by a farmhouse wall and write of the weather or the garden. The letters they composed now were silent, frantic prayers spoken only in the quiet architecture of their own minds. Mother, I am walking. I do not know where we are going, but I am keeping my head down. Please, keep the light on for me. When evening finally fell, it offered no real sanctuary, only a chilling, heavy darkness. They were forbidden to light fires, for fear of drawing the eyes of the machines that prowled the night sky. And so, they sat in the shadows of the hedgerows and the deep ditches, huddled closely together for warmth. The spring nights, which had felt so gentle just a week ago, now held a bitter, biting cold. In this profound darkness, the private fears they had kept hidden during the day began to whisper in their ears. They wondered if the unstoppable force pushing them would ever slow down. They wondered if they would ever see the green hills of their homes again, or if they were destined to wander these strange, dusty roads forever. Yet, even in the grip of this quiet terror, they found ways to tether themselves to the light. In the pitch black, a hand would reach out, blindly finding a shoulder, offering a reassuring squeeze. A piece of a stale biscuit would be broken in two and passed silently to a hungry friend. They listened to the breathing of the men around them, finding a strange, rhythmic comfort in the knowledge that they were not alone. They were a brotherhood forged not in the fire of battle, but in the quiet, desperate endurance of the retreat. The landscape they moved through became a surreal, waking dream. They marched past magnificent, ancient chateaux with their windows blown out, their manicured gardens trampled by thousands of heavy boots. They crossed rivers over bridges that trembled under their weight, watching the dark water rush beneath them, wishing they could be carried away by its swift, unthinking current. They were moving through a world that was dismantling itself piece by piece, an unraveling tapestry of a life they had only just begun to understand. And always, pushing them forward, was the heavy, unspoken realization of what lay behind them. It was a pressure in the air, a shadow that seemed to lengthen with every step they took. They were not running wildly, they were walking with a grim, steady determination, carrying the weight of a fractured world on their young, tired shoulders. They did not speak of the fear that lived in their throats. They only looked forward, their eyes searching the hazy, dusty horizon for a sign, for a stopping point, for a miracle. They did not know that the land they were walking upon was slowly running out. They did not yet know that their long, dusty footsteps were leading them toward the edge of the world, where the green fields would surrender to the sand, and the sky would meet the vast, indifferent gray of the sea. They only knew that they must keep moving, one heavy boot placed carefully in front of the other, walking through the torn open sky, carrying the quiet, enduring hope of surviving the longest spring of their lives. The world had narrowed down to the space of a single footstep, rising and falling in the pale, choking dust. There were no longer borders or towns, no maps or grand strategies, only the unending ribbon of the road and the rhythmic, shuffling sound of thousands of heavy boots dragging against the earth. The landscape of northern France, once a vibrant tapestry of spring greens and rich, dark soils, had been drained of its color. Everything was painted in the soft, muted gray of pulverized stone and dry dirt, kicked up by the desperate march of exhausted men. It settled on their shoulders like a phantom snow, coating their eyelashes, finding its way into the deep creases of their uniforms, and turning their youthful, vibrant faces into statues carved from ash. The march had become a strange, waking slumber. When a man has walked for days without sleep, the mind begins to detach itself from the punishing reality of the body. The repetitive, hypnotic crunch of leather on gravel became a kind of dark lullaby. Step after left step. Right after right. It was a trance that allowed them to keep moving long after their muscles had begged them to surrender. They walked with their eyes half closed, their heads bowed low, surrendering to the gentle, forward pull of the column. To stop was to break the spell, and to break the spell was to risk never being able to stand up again. They bore the heavy weight of their rifles, the wooden stocks and cold metal barrels pressing deeply into their bruised shoulders. But heavier still was the invisible weight they carried within. It was the weight of a sudden, bewildering retreat. The weight of leaving behind the quiet fields they had been told to protect. The weight of the unknown that stretched out endlessly before them. They were a moving river of khaki and canvas, winding blindly toward a destination they could only imagine, driven by the whispered promise of an ocean they could not yet see. In this shared, quiet suffering, the traditional boundaries that separated them dissolved into the haze. Titles, ranks, and hometowns lost their meaning. The man marching to the left was no longer a stranger from a different county. He was a mirror, reflecting the exact same exhaustion, the exact same thirst, the exact same quiet longing for home. They were bound together by a profound, wordless intimacy, becoming brothers in the dust. Conversations had long since faded away. It took too much precious breath to speak. Instead, they communicated in the soft, subtle language of the road. A gentle hand reaching out to steady a soldier who had stumbled over a hidden route. A shared, weary glance between two men as they passed an abandoned farmhouse, its windows dark and empty. A hand resting briefly on a friend's shoulder during a momentary halt, conveying a message that needed no words: "I am here. We are still alive. Keep walking." Thirst was a constant, quiet companion, sitting heavy and dry in their throats. The canteens swinging at their hips were mostly light and hollow, the water inside more precious than gold. When a halt was called, usually in the fleeting shade of a battered hedgerow or the quiet ruin of an ancient stone barn, the true measure of their humanity revealed itself. A soldier, his lips cracked and dusted with white earth, would unscrew the cap of his dented tin flask. He would take a sip, just enough to wet his tongue, fighting the primal urge to drink it all. Then, with a quiet grace, he would wipe the rim with his sleeve and pass it to the man sitting slumped beside him, a man whose name he did not know. The stranger would take the flask with trembling hands, his eyes conveying a depth of gratitude that no language could adequately capture. He, too, would take only a meager sip, preserving the lukewarm, metallic water for the next man in the circle. It was a holy communion of survival, a quiet testament to the everyday heroism of simple restraint and boundless empathy. When the evenings drew near, painting the hazy sky in soft shades of bruised purple and dim charcoal, the temperature would slowly begin to drop. The cooling air brought a small measure of relief, but also a new, creeping chill. It was in these twilight hours that the mind would inevitably drift back across the channel. Hands that were too numb and blistered to hold a pencil would write invisible letters in the quiet architecture of their minds. "Dear Mother," a boy from the Scottish Highlands would whisper in his thoughts, his eyes fixed on the silhouette of the trees ahead. "My boots are heavy, and the road is very long. But I am remembering the smell of the heather on the hills, and it is carrying me forward. My darling," a young husband would think, touching a frayed photograph tucked safely inside his breast pocket, close to his beating heart. "I am walking back to you. I do not know how many miles are left, but every step is a step closer to your front door. Keep the kettle warm." These silent letters were their tethers to the world of the living, fragile threads of love that kept them anchored when the exhaustion threatened to pull them under. In the deepest dark of the night, when the march was briefly paused so the men could collapse onto the damp earth, a different kind of quiet magic would occur. From the depths of a canvas pouch, a miracle would be produced, a single, battered cigarette, slightly bent and smelling faintly of damp tobacco. It was a treasure beyond reckoning. A match would be struck, the sudden hiss and flare of yellow light momentarily pushing back the shadows. Cupped hands, dirty and scarred, would form a delicate, protective shell around the tiny flame, a gesture of almost religious reverence. The glowing ember would illuminate a pair of tired, grateful eyes for just a fraction of a second before the match was quickly extinguished, lest it draw the gaze of the machines that hunted in the dark. The cigarette would be passed down the line of seated men in total silence. Each man would take one long, slow draw, letting the warm smoke fill his lungs, feeling it soothe his frayed nerves for a fleeting, beautiful moment. The glowing red tip floated in the darkness like a captured firefly, drifting gently from hand to hand, a beacon of shared comfort. It was never about the tobacco, it was about the warmth of the touch as the cigarette was transferred, the quiet knowledge that for a few minutes, in the vast, cold night, they were providing solace to one another. As the march resumed, pushing through the veil of the early morning mist, the nature of the landscape began to subtly shift. The dense forests and rolling hills slowly gave way to flatter, more open terrain. The air, which had been thick with the smell of turned earth and cordite, began to carry a strange, foreign scent. It was a faint, clean smell, sharply distinct from the dust of the road. The men did not know the geography of where they were. They did not know the names of the canals they crossed or the shattered villages they ghosted through. But they felt the change in the atmosphere. A cool, damp breeze brushed against their feverish cheeks, stirring the heavy fabric of their coats. It tasted faintly of salt. The sea. It was a word whispered down the ragged columns, passed from cracked lips to eager ears. The sea. It became a mythic destination, a promise of salvation lying just beyond the hazy horizon. They could not see the water yet. There were no crashing waves to guide them, no gulls crying in the overcast sky. But the mere idea of the ocean acted as a gentle magnet, pulling them forward with a renewed, quiet desperation. The sea meant an end to the walking. The sea meant ships, and ships meant home. And so, they adjusted the heavy straps on their aching shoulders. They took a deep breath of the salt-tinged air, letting it clear the dust from their lungs. They looked at the backs of the men walking in front of them, the rhythmic swaying of their packs, the steady, hypnotic cadence of their boots. They did not march with the crisp precision of a parade ground, nor did they run with the panic of the defeated. They walked with the profound, quiet dignity of men who have endured the unendurable. They walked for the mothers waiting by the radios, for the sweethearts holding on to faded photographs, and for the brothers beside them who could no longer carry themselves. Step after step. Mile after mile. The endless ribbon of the road unwound before them, leading them out of the dusty heart of the continent and toward the gray, misty edges of the world. The footsteps in the dust continued, a soft, relentless rhythm beating against the earth, echoing with the quiet, unconquerable resilience of the human spirit, moving ever closer to where the land simply ends. The heavy road finally softened beneath their boots, exchanging the hard rhythm of stone for the quiet surrender of sand. They had walked for so long, carrying the immense weight of the retreating world on their young shoulders, that the sudden absence of the road felt like a strange, waking dream. As they crested the final ridge of pale, wind-swept dune grass, the choking dust of their long journey was gently blown away by a sharp, cool breeze. And there it was. The sea. It did not look like the bright, sparkling holiday waters of their childhood memories, filled with the echoes of laughter and striped canvas deck chairs. It was a vast, sprawling canvas of slate and silver, stretching out endlessly until it melted into the bruised gray of the sky. For days, they had been pushed forward, driven by the invisible, heavy pressure of a storm breaking behind them. Now, they had simply run out of earth. There was nowhere left to walk. The continent had ended. They stood in quiet all along the ridges, letting the heavy wooden stocks of their rifles slip from their tired hands to fall softly into the dunes. The water lapped gently at the shore, a slow, indifferent rhythm that cared nothing for the fires burning in the distance, or the history unraveling on its banks. It was a strange, surreal trap. If they looked over their shoulders, the sky inland was painted in angry, unnatural strokes of orange and black, the echoes of a crumbling world rumbling like a very distant, muted thunder. But before them lay only the calm, rhythmic breathing of the tide. They were caught in the space between, perched on the very edge of the map, held captive by the gentle, pulling currents of the English Channel. It felt less like a battlefield and more like the quiet waiting room of the world. With no more miles to conquer, the immense exhaustion they had kept at bay through sheer force of will finally washed over them. Slowly, like autumn leaves settling to the ground, the men began to sink onto the soft, damp sand. They unlaced boots that had become almost permanently molded to their blistered, aching feet, wincing at the sweet, agonizing relief of the cool sea air against their bare skin. They massaged their cramped calves and let their heads fall back against their canvas packs, staring up at a sky that felt far too large and far too empty. As the hours stretched on, the vast expanse of the beach slowly transformed. It became a sprawling, silent city of khaki and gray. Thousands upon thousands of men, wrapped tightly in heavy wool coats, dotted the dunes like pebbles scattered by the receding tide. They huddled together in small, quiet clusters, seeking the fragile warmth of another human body against the creeping, damp sea chill. In this sprawling city of sand, the quiet, everyday heroism of survival began to unfold. A young corporal, his face pale and smudged with the soot of a dozen burning villages, used his rounded tin helmet as a makeshift pillow, finally allowing his heavy eyelids to close. Beside him, an older soldier, a man who had barely spoken for 3 days, carefully opened a battered tin of pears he had miraculously carried through the long march. He did not eat them himself. With a small pocket knife, he gently handed a single, golden slice to the sleeping boy when he woke, a quiet, unspoken offering of sweetness in a profoundly bitter world. Men sat with their knees drawn tightly to their chests, watching the rolling waves, their minds crossing the cold water long before their bodies ever could. They held damp, crumpled photographs of their wives, their children, their mothers, tracing the familiar lines of smiling faces with dirty, trembling thumbs. "I am here, at the edge," a baker from London whispered into the sea breeze, his voice barely audible over the breaking surf. "The water is so very cold, and the queue is so terribly long, but I am looking toward home. Put the kettle on, my love. I am looking toward you." There was no post office here on the sprawling sands, no red pillar box to catch their written words. So they cast their letters out onto the tide in complete silence, trusting the invisible wind to carry their quiet promises across the channel. They closed their eyes and imagined the smell of their own hallways, the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece, the soft weight of a familiar blanket. These memories were the only armor they had left. The waiting became its own kind of heavy endurance. There was no charging forward, no grand, sweeping action to distract the mind. There was only the immense, quiet bravery of sitting perfectly still while the world held its breath. They watched the white seagulls circle lazily overhead, marveling at the birds' simple freedom to spread their wings and simply fly away from the edge of the world. Some men built small, pathetic windbreaks out of discarded wooden crates, piles of damp driftwood, and abandoned equipment, trying desperately to carve out a tiny pocket of shelter in the vast, open space. They huddled behind these fragile walls, trading half-smoked, bent cigarettes, protecting the tiny, glowing ember from the sea wind with cupped hands. The brief flare of a match illuminated tired eyes and unshaven cheeks, a fleeting moment of shared warmth before the grayness swallowed them again. Others found stray dogs that had wandered down from the abandoned coastal towns, lost and shivering on the beach. Soldiers who had lost everything would gently coax these frightened animals into their laps, wrapping them in spare wool tunics, finding a profound, grounding comfort in the simple act of stroking a dog's soft ears. It was a tether to a gentler life, a reminder of the quiet, ordinary world that still existed somewhere across the water. As the long afternoon slowly dissolved into evening, the color drained completely from the world, leaving only the soft, charcoal sketches of men waiting in the twilight. The sea turned from a metallic slate to a deep, bruised obsidian, the frothy whitecaps glowing faintly in the fading light. The sound of the water became a continuous, soothing murmur, a steady, rhythmic shhhhhhh, shhhhhhh against the shore. To the exhausted men, it sounded like a mother hushing a frightened child in the dark. It was a lullaby sung by the earth itself, a gentle, washing sound that smoothed the frayed edges of their nerves and coaxed them toward a fitful slumber. They lay on their backs in the cool sand, staring up as the first stars began to prick through the velvet canopy of the night sky. They were the exact same stars that were shining over the slate rooftops and brick chimneys of their homes, just 30 miles away. 30 miles. In the old world, it was a distance they could have easily traveled in a single, sunny afternoon. But here, across the dark, rolling, unpredictable water, it felt like a lifetime. It felt like an eternity. And so, they pulled their collars up against the wind, wrapping their coats tighter around their shivering frames. They leaned against one another, forming long, sleeping chains of quiet brotherhood in the dark. They surrendered to the gentle, rhythmic lullaby of the tide, their breaths rising and falling in time with the sea, quietly waiting on the sprawling sands for a miracle to rise from the dark horizon. To leave the land entirely, they had to walk upon a trembling ribbon of wood, suspended in the dark between the fading earth and the deep, cold sea. There was a strange and fragile bridge stretching out from the sandy shore, plunging straight into the heart of the black water. It was not meant to be a pier for great ships, nor a pathway for thousands of weary souls. It was simply a breakwater, a long, narrow skeleton of pale timber, rough-hewn planks, and concrete pilings meant only to calm the tides. But in the quiet desperation of the night, this precarious, winding structure, jutting out into the misty channel, became the single most important path in the world. It was a narrow tightrope of hope, and to reach it, the men had to leave the soft, grounding embrace of the sand. Stepping onto the mole was a profound shift in the universe. The familiar, muffled crunch of boots on the beach was replaced by a hollow, resonant thud. Wood against leather. A sound that echoed down into the dark, swirling water below. The air out here, away from the sheltering dunes, was entirely different. It was biting, wet, and heavy with the smell of old rope, decaying seaweed, and the vast, metallic brine of the open ocean. The men formed a single, agonizingly slow line, stretching from the edge of the shore all the way out into the fog, disappearing like ghosts into the mist. It was a delicate, silent procession. The pathway was terribly narrow, leaving no room for a misstep, no space for a sudden loss of balance. On either side, there was nothing but the sheer, unforgiving drop into the freezing, restless channel. As they walked, or rather, as they shuffled forward inch by aching inch, the wood beneath them creaked and groaned in protest. It was an eerie, living sound, the timber sighing under the immense, collective weight of a retreating army. Through the gaps in the damp floorboards, the men could look down and see the hungry whitecaps of the waves, swirling and slapping against the barnacle-crusted pillars. The water was a mesmerizing, terrifying abyss, a dark void that seemed to pull at their tired minds, whispering for them to simply let go, to lay down their heavy packs and sleep in the deep. This was a quiet, paralyzing terror. For a boy who had grown up surrounded by the rolling green hills of the Midlands, who had never learned to swim, the black water churning inches beneath his boots was a waking nightmare. The wind whipped furiously out here, catching the heavy wool of their overcoats like sails, threatening to blow them off the edge and into the void. Yet, in this suspended state of vulnerability, a beautiful, unseen architecture of human kindness held them together. They realized, with profound clarity, that they could not survive the walk alone. And so, they reached out in the dark. A hand wrapped tightly around the canvas webbing of the man in front of them. A shoulder pressed firmly against the back of a stranger. They formed a continuous, living chain, a lifeline woven from blistered fingers and quiet courage. If one man closed his eyes, overcome by the dizzying sway of the tide, the gentle, steadying grip of the soldier behind him would pull him back to center. If a boy stumbled on a loose plank, a dozen hands would instantly dart out from the shadows to catch his collar, holding him fast over the precipice until he found his footing once more. No words were exchanged in these moments of salvation. There was only the soft pat on the back, a quiet squeeze of the shoulder, an exhale of shared relief. They were balancing each other's weight, balancing each other's fears, carrying one another across the dark water. In the freezing, suspended hours of waiting on the wooden slats, the men retreated into the quiet sanctuaries of their own minds. To look down was to court the abyss, so they looked straight ahead, staring into the thick, woolen fabric of the coat belonging to the man in front of them, focusing on the slow, rhythmic rising and falling of his breathing. A young father, his knuckles white with the cold, closed his eyes and tried to transform the terrifying creak of the mole into a familiar sound. "It is only the floorboards of the hallway," he told himself softly. "It is only the old oak step on the stairs back home. I am just walking down the hall in the dark to check on the baby. The floor is solid. I am safe." He repeated this silent, desperate prayer over and over, letting the imagined warmth of his home overlay the freezing reality of the channel. Another soldier, a quiet clerk whose glasses were perpetually fogged with the sea mist, kept his mind tethered by mentally writing the most ordinary, mundane letter he could conjure. "My dearest," he thought, shivering as a spray of cold water misted across his face. "The damp here is quite dreadful for my joints, and I have lost one of my good woolen mittens. But the sea air is very bracing. I hope the roses are taking well to the trellis this year." It was the gentle absurdity of these thoughts, the stubborn clinging to the gentle, domestic world they had left behind, that kept the panic at bay. The progression was agonizingly slow. For every few minutes of walking, there were long, stretching hours of simply standing still. Standing over the dark water, waiting for a shadow to emerge from the fog. They learned to sleep while standing upright on the narrow planks, locked together in their human chain. Their heads would nod forward, their chins resting on their chests, their exhausted minds finding a few fleeting seconds of dreamless rest before the line shuffled forward another foot. They were so incredibly tired. The urge to simply sit down on the wet wood, to close their eyes and let whatever happened happen, was a heavy, sweet temptation. But whenever a man's knees began to buckle, whenever the exhaustion threatened to pull him down onto the timber, the men beside him would gently bear his weight. They would hook their arms through his, propping him up like a fragile, precious thing. "Not here," the gesture said. "Not yet. Just a little further into the dark." And then, just as the cold began to feel absolute, just as the wood beneath them felt as though it might finally give way, a subtle shift would occur in the mist ahead. The shape of the darkness would change. It was no longer the flat, infinite void of the ocean. It was a silhouette. A towering wall of painted steel, rising quietly from the water like a gentle leviathan. A ship. The realization rippled backward down the line of men, not as a shout of triumph, but as a collective, shuddering sigh of relief. As they drew closer to the end of the wooden pathway, the vague shape sharpened into the comforting reality of a vessel. They could smell the warm oil from her engines, a smell that meant movement, and warmth, and home. They could see the dim, hooded glow of a lantern on her deck, swinging softly with the motion of the sea. The final steps were the most precarious of all. There was no grand gangway, no sturdy bridge connecting the trembling pier to the bobbing ship. There was only a narrow gap of black water, rising and falling unpredictably, separating the wooden edge of the continent from the steel deck of salvation. A sailor, his face obscured by the darkness, would reach out over the rail. His hands were thick, rough, and smelling of salt and grease. "Come on then, lad," a gruff, heavily accented voice would whisper over the sound of the waves. "I've got you." And the exhausted soldier, his legs trembling from the long march, his heart pounding in his chest, would take a breath. He would let go of the canvas belt of the man in front of him. He would step to the very edge of the wet, groaning timber, looking down one last time at the swirling abyss. And then, trusting his life entirely to the reaching hands of a stranger, he would step across the void. The solid, unyielding clang of a heavy boot landing on a steel deck was the most beautiful sound in the world. It was the sound of a promise kept. It was the sound of leaving the trembling, uncertain pathway behind. As they huddled on the deck, wrapping themselves in whatever dry blankets could be found, they looked back at the fog. They could barely see the narrow wooden pier anymore, just the faint, ghostly outlines of the men still standing in the mist, a long, quiet line of brothers patiently waiting their turn to walk upon the water. The sea churned blindly below, the wind howled through the pilings, but the delicate, beautiful chain of human trust held fast in the dark, stretching endlessly across the night. While the boys waited in the shadows of the dunes, a very different kind of quiet was settling over the harbors of home. Across the dark, rolling expanse of the channel, the English coastline was draped in the soft, fragrant mist of late spring. It was a world entirely untouched by the dust and the heavy tread of retreating boots. Here, the evening smelled of blooming hawthorn, of damp earth, and the familiar, comforting scent of salt spray clinging to ancient stone breakwaters. In the seaside towns and quiet fishing villages, the rhythm of life was dictated not by the anxious drumbeat of conflict, but by the gentle, predictable breathing of the tides. In cozy sitting rooms, families gathered around the warm, amber glow of the wireless radio, listening to the soft crackle of the broadcast while knitting needles clicked softly in the lamplight. In the bakeries, the sweet, heavy aroma of rising dough filled the air as men with flour-dusted hands prepared the ovens for the morning loaf. Along the cobblestone quays, small wooden boats bobbed lazily at their moorings, their rigging chiming like soft bells in the sea breeze. It was a landscape of profound, undisturbed peace. But then, a whisper began to ripple through the mist. It did not arrive with the blare of sirens or the dramatic ringing of church bells. It came as a soft knock on a heavy oak door in the fading twilight. It was a murmured conversation over a garden fence, a quiet message passed across the wooden counter of the local grocer, a somber, low voice reading a bulletin on the evening news. The grand, steel ships of the Navy, with their deep, heavy hulls, could not reach the shallow, sandy shores where the exhausted men were waiting. The water there was too thin, the sandbanks too treacherous. The plea was simple, unassuming, and heartbreakingly fragile. They needed the little boats. They needed the pleasure cruisers that usually spent their summers gliding down gentle rivers. They needed the shallow draft ferries, the sturdy little fishing smacks, the wooden lifeboats, and the weekend sailing yachts. They needed the vessels that belonged not to the military, but to the people. The response to this call was not a roar of unified defiance, but 1,000 quiet, private decisions made in the soft light of evening kitchens and damp hallways. In a small coastal village, a baker stood at his wooden work table. He had just pulled the last batch of bread from the warm brick oven. The air around him was thick with the scent of yeast and comfort. He listened to the quiet voice of the harbor master who had stepped through his door, bringing the news from the coast. The baker slowly wiped his flour-covered hands on his apron. He looked toward the window, where the dark sea met the night sky, and then he looked at his wife, who was standing quietly in the doorway. There was no need for a lengthy discussion, no grand declarations of bravery. There was only a silent, profound understanding passing between them. He untied his apron, draped it carefully over a wooden chair, and reached for his heavy wool sweater. A few streets away, a father was walking quietly down the hallway of his home. He paused outside the bedroom of his young children, gently pushing the door open just an inch to listen to the soft, rhythmic sound of their breathing in the dark. He was a man who spent his Sundays sailing a small, white-painted sloop in the safe, sheltered waters of the bay, teaching his son how to tie a bowline knot and read the wind. Now, he walked downstairs to the airing cupboard. With slow, deliberate movements, he pulled out every spare woolen blanket the family owned, folding them neatly into the canvas sea bag. He was thinking of the boys shivering on the sprawling sands, boys who were someone else's sons, waiting in the cold. All along the coast, in the deep, hushed hours before the dawn, ordinary men were stepping out of their warm homes and walking down toward the water. There were bank clerks and tugboat captains, dentists and retired sailors, grandfathers with weathered faces and young apprentices who had barely learned to chart a course. They wore thick, knitted cardigans, worn corduroy trousers, and rubber sea boots. They carried thermoses filled with sweet, scalding tea, and tin boxes packed with buttered sandwiches wrapped in wax paper by wives whose hands trembled just slightly as they tied the string. The harbors, usually silent at this hour, were alive with a gentle, purposeful hum. It was a ballet of quiet preparation. Men moved like shadows along the wooden docks, their footsteps muffled by the damp air. Lanterns were lit, casting warm, golden pools of light across the dark, rippling water. The air was filled with the soft clinking of metal hooks, the heavy splash of anchors being hauled up from the mud, and the squeak of stiff ropes being pulled through brass pulleys. There was a profound sense of reverence in these small actions. Every extra can of petrol lugged onto a wooden deck, every life preserver checked and secured, was a prayer cast out into the dark. They did not know the exact coordinates of where they were going. They did not know what they would find when the sun finally rose over the foreign shore. They only knew that across the black expanse of the channel, someone was waiting for a reaching hand. On the stone piers, a few women stood wrapped in heavy coats, the collars pulled up against the biting sea chill. They had come to cast off the ropes and to say their quiet goodbyes. There were no tears, no dramatic embraces. The fear was certainly there, a cold, heavy stone resting in the bottom of their stomachs, but they folded it away, hiding it beneath brave smiles and gentle touches. A wife would press her cheek against her husband's rough, unshaven face, her hands lingering on the lapels of his jacket. "Keep the wind at your back," she would whisper, her voice barely louder than the lapping tide. "And come back before the tea gets cold." Then came the sounds of departure. Not the deep, earth-shaking blast of a steamship's horn, but a chorus of modest, stuttering heartbeats. One by one, the small engines coughed to life. They sputtered, caught, and then settled into a steady, rhythmic thrumming that vibrated through the wooden floorboards and out into the night air. It was a comforting, domestic sound, like a dozen sewing machines working in unison, or the gentle putter of a tractor in a distant field. The ropes were slipped from the iron cleats, falling into the water with a soft splash. The men took their places at the wooden helms, their hands gripping the worn, varnished spokes of the wheels. Slowly, gracefully, the armada of little ships began to pull away from the safety of the stone walls. They glided past the sleeping houses, past the darkened storefronts, and past the tall, blinking lighthouses that stood as solitary guardians at the edge of the deep. They moved out of the sheltered bays and into the vast, open embrace of the English Channel. As they left the coast behind, the comforting lights of home began to shrink, fading into small, glowing embers before being swallowed entirely by the creeping sea mist. The men were alone now, wrapped in the profound, isolating darkness of the ocean. The water here was different. It did not gently lap, it rolled with a heavy, ancient power, lifting the small wooden bows toward the stars and dropping them gently into the deep troughs of the waves. The air grew significantly colder, carrying the sharp, biting chill of the open sea. The civilian captains pulled their knitted caps down over their ears and leaned forward, their eyes straining to pierce the gloom. They navigated by the faint, silver light of the moon slipping through the clouds, and by the tiny, glowing dials of the compasses mounted on their wooden dashboards. There was a beautiful, quiet solidarity in the dark. Though they could not clearly see the boats beside them, they could hear the collective hum of the engines, a sprawling, invisible net of machinery moving together across the water. Occasionally, a voice would call out softly over the waves, a reassuring check from one neighbor to another. "How's the tide treating you, Arthur?" A voice would drift through the fog. "Smooth enough, William." "Just keeping her steady," would come the gentle reply. These were not soldiers sailing to conquer a foreign land. They were neighbors, answering a desperate knock at the door. They were men who understood that when a storm rolls in and the waters rise, you do not lock your door and tend only to your own fire. You take your lantern, you untie your boat, and you row out into the dark to see who might be drowning in the deep. They sat alone with their thoughts as the hours stretched on, accompanied only by the hypnotic churning of the wake behind them and the rhythmic thumping of their engines. They thought of the empty beds they had left behind, the aprons hanging on the chairs, the unread books resting on their nightstands. They felt the immense vulnerability of their small wooden crafts, frail shells of timber and canvas floating above an unfathomable depth. But as they gripped the wheels, their hands were steady. The voices that had called to them from across the channel had been quiet, but they had been clear. And so, the fathers, the bakers, and the fishermen sailed onward, cutting a path through the mist, carrying the warmth, the courage, and the gentle, unbreakable spirit of their quiet island directly into the heart of the waiting dark. Out in the deepest part of the channel, the world shrank to the size of a wooden deck in the pale, shivering glow of a single compass light. There was no earth beneath them now, only the fathomless, ancient breathing of the open sea. The English coastline had long since melted away into the velvet black of the night, taking with it the comforting silhouettes of church spires and chalk cliffs. In this profound and watery darkness, the armada of little ships found themselves suspended between two worlds. They were a sprawling, unlikely flock of river cruisers, fishing smacks, and weekend yachts, bobbing like autumn leaves upon a dark and heavy tide. If you listened closely to the night air, beneath the gentle, rhythmic shhhhshhhh of the water parting at their wooden bows, you could hear the heartbeat of the fleet. It was the stuttering, mechanical pulse of hundreds of small civilian engines. They hummed and coughed, sputtered and purred, sending a continuous, reassuring vibration through the floorboards and into the souls of the men who stood at the helms. It was a deeply domestic sound, reminiscent of Sunday drives through the countryside or the quiet churning of a village mill. Here, in the vast, intimidating expanse of the ocean, that humble sound was a tether to the gentle lives they had left behind. The men gripping the varnished wooden wheels and rusted iron tillers were not built for war. They wore no uniforms, only the thick, knitted wool of fishermen's sweaters, tweed flat caps pulled low against the biting wind, and heavy rubber boots that smelled of river mud and salt. Their hands were accustomed to weighing flour, sorting mail, or gently turning the pages of a ledger. Now, those same hands were wrapped tightly around the helms, knuckles pale in the moonlight, reading the subtle shifts of the rolling waves. The cold out here was a living thing. It was a heavy, damp mist that seeped through layers of cordite and wool, settling deep into their bones. To fight it, they leaned into the small, enclosed spaces of their wheelhouses, drawing warmth from the churning engines below deck. Every so often, a captain would take one hand from the wheel, reach blindly into the dark, and unscrew the cap of a tartan thermos. The smell of sweet, milky tea would briefly mingle with the sharp scent of diesel and brine. A single, scalding sip was passed from the older man at the wheel to the young nephew standing watch at the bow, a quiet, liquid warmth that tasted entirely of home. As the hours drifted by, the darkness played tricks on the mind. The sea and the sky blended into one seamless canvas of black, leaving the men to navigate by the gentle grace of the heavens. Above them, the stars bloomed in a brilliant, icy canopy. They were the very same stars that had guided generations of sailors before them, silent, steady, and wonderfully indifferent to the troubles of the earth below. The men looked up, finding the familiar shapes of the constellations, drawing a quiet comfort from their permanence. The North Star hung like a silver lantern in the sky, a quiet promise that the world still held on to some order, some ancient and unshakable truth. In the long, suspended stretches of the crossing, there was nothing to do but steer, and nothing to hold on to but thought. In the quiet darkness of a motorized pleasure yacht, a man who usually spent his days as a bank manager found himself composing a silent letter to his wife. He imagined her sleeping in their warm bed in Kent, the quilt pulled up to her chin. "My darling," he whispered to the sea, his eyes fixed on the rolling water. "The boat is holding up beautifully, just as she does on the Thames. The water is a bit rougher here, but do not fret. I have wrapped my scarf twice around my neck, just as you instructed. I am simply taking the boat for a long, midnight run. I will be home before the Sunday roast is in the oven." He clung to these quiet, ordinary thoughts, using them to push back the encroaching dread of the unknown. Across the water, in a battered wooden fishing smack, a young apprentice, barely 17, sat on an overturned bucket. He clutched the small, smooth stone his mother had pressed into his palm just before he untied the mooring ropes. His heart fluttered like a trapped bird against his ribs. The sea felt too large, the night too deep. But then, the rough, heavy hand of the boat's owner rested gently on his shoulder. There was no grand speech, only a soft squeeze and a low, rumbling voice over the engine's hum. "Steady on, lad. We're doing a good thing tonight." And the boy, drawing strength from the simple presence of another soul, exhaled slowly, letting the panic slip over the side and into the deep. They were completely alone, yet surrounded by 1,000 invisible brothers. Because they maintained strict radio silence, there were no crackling voices to pierce the night. They communicated through the shadowy proximity of the other boats. A man peering through the mist would catch the faint, ghostly white of a sail catching the moonlight, or the dim red glow of a port lantern dipping behind a swell. Sometimes, when the boats drifted close enough on the rolling tide, a soft voice would carry across the gap. "How's the fuel holding, Tom?" A shadow would call out from the darkness. "Half a tank, Mr. Miller." "She's drinking it slow," another shadow would reply. "Good lad. Keep close to my wake." These brief, hushed exchanges were lifelines of sanity. They reminded the men that they were not solitary ghosts wandering the deep, but a united, living chain stretching all the way back to the White Cliffs. As the deepest hour of the night approached, the horizon ahead began to change. It started as a subtle bruised smudge on the edge of the sky, a faint discoloration in the absolute black. But as the little ships pushed steadily onward, the smudge deepened into a dull, terrifying orange. It was not the warm, welcoming glow of a sunrise, nor the steady beam of a coastal lighthouse. It was an angry, trembling light that bled upward into the clouds. The fires of Dunkirk. The men stood silently at their helms, watching the burning shoreline slowly reveal itself. The contrast was profoundly surreal. Beneath them, the ocean was cool, indifferent, and draped in a peaceful, rhythmic silence. Above them, the stars were cool and bright. But straight ahead, the world was on fire. The smoke rose in thick, twisting columns, catching the orange light and turning the sky into a cathedral of ash and ember. To look at that horizon was to look into the mouth of a nightmare. Every natural, human instinct screamed at them to pull hard on the wooden wheels, to turn the bows around and race back to the safety of the English mist. But the hands on the wheels did not flinch. The ordinary men, the fathers, the grocers, the mechanics, simply set their jaws and stared into the glow. They thought of the boys waiting on the beach beneath that burning sky. Boys who were terrified, freezing, and looking out at the dark water, praying for a miracle. And so, with a quiet, breathtaking heroism, the little ships kept their bows pointed squarely toward the flames. They did not speed up in a rush of dramatic adrenaline, nor did they slow down in hesitation. They simply maintained their steady, rhythmic, puttering pace, a humble procession of grace cutting through the dark. Inside the cabins of these tiny vessels, a beautiful, gentle preparation began. Men who had never been nurses or caretakers moved with the tender efficiency of mothers. They opened the canvas bags they had hauled from their homes. In the dim light of the binnacle, they began to unfold the spare woolen blankets, draping them carefully over the leather seats of the pleasure cruisers, or piling them in the dry corners of the fishing holds. They wanted the boats to look soft. They wanted the boats to look like sanctuaries. A butcher from Dover, piloting his small motorized skiff, took a clean, white cloth he usually used to wipe down his shop counter, and carefully wiped away the sea salt that had crusted on the wooden benches. "Must have it clean for them," he murmured to himself, smoothing the damp wood. "Must give them a proper place to sit." He arranged his few meager supplies, a tin of biscuits, a half-empty packet of cigarettes, a jug of fresh water, placing them where reaching hands might easily find them. He was setting the table for unexpected guests, preparing a quiet feast of survival. The smell of the air was changing now. The clean, bracing scent of the open ocean was being swallowed by the heavy, acrid tang of burning oil, scorched timber, and distant ruin. The water beneath them, once a deep, fathomless black, began to reflect the dancing orange light of the fires, turning the channel into a rippling mirror of copper and gold. They were crossing the final threshold. The gentle lullaby of the deep water was giving way to the shallow, chaotic currents of the coastline. The men gripped the wheels tighter, their eyes stinging from the drifting smoke, their hearts heavy with the quiet realization of where they had arrived. They had left the peaceful shores of their quiet lives, sailed through the velvet expanse of the starry night, and brought their tiny, wooden lanterns directly to the edge of the dark tide. The journey across the water was ending, but the gentle, monumental work of bringing the boys home was only just beginning. To survive the open sky, a man must learn to make himself as small as a single grain of sand. The sprawling beaches of the coast were beautiful in a strange, heartbroken way. The dunes rolled and dipped like pale, frozen waves, tufted with stiff green marram grass that bent low in the constant sea breeze. In another life, in a gentler time, this was a place for striped canvas chairs, for children building grand fortresses with wooden spades, for the sweet, sticky melting of ice cream in the late afternoon sun. But now, it was a vast, open waiting room at the edge of the world, and the men who inhabited it were entirely exposed to the vastness of the heavens. When you are waiting for salvation from the water, you must constantly watch the sky. And the sky above the beach was a restless, unpredictable canopy. It would be peaceful for hours, a dome of soft, cloudy gray that smelled of salt and distant rain. The men would sit in quiet circles, their heavy boots unlaced, letting the cool air soothe their bruised feet. They would talk in hushed voices about the villages they had left behind, passing a single, dented canteen of lukewarm water between them, making it stretch through sheer willpower and grace. But then, the air would begin to change. It never began with a loud noise, but rather a subtle, sickening shift in the pressure. A distant hum would vibrate at the very edges of hearing, like a swarm of angry bees gathering miles away. It was a mechanical weather rolling in, a sudden, dark storm that had nothing to do with the clouds. When the hum deepened into a drone, and the drone sharpened into a high, piercing whistle, the great, sprawling city of men would vanish. There were no trenches here, no thick stone walls or deep, sheltering cellars. There was only the earth. With a quiet, desperate unison, thousands of young boys and tired men threw themselves face down into the dunes. They pressed their bodies as deeply into the sand as they possibly could, trying to melt into the landscape. They dug with their bare hands, their fingers frantically scraping away the dry, loose topsoil to reach the cold, damp, packed sand beneath. They curled their shoulders inward, bringing their knees up, trying to fold themselves into the smallest, least significant shapes they could manage. They pulled their heavy tin helmets down over their necks, making themselves into human tortoises, vulnerable and trembling in the open light. As the danger swept low overhead, the ground beneath them would shudder and buck. The sand, usually so soft and yielding, would suddenly jump and vibrate against their cheeks, stinging their skin like thousands of tiny, shattered pieces of glass. It was a terrifying, surreal sensation, feeling the very earth tremble beneath your chest. In these moments of absolute powerlessness, the beach became a sanctuary of quiet, desperate prayer. Noses buried in the grit, eyes squeezed tightly shut against the falling dust, the men whispered into the earth. They did not pray for grand victories or the defeat of armies. They prayed for the smallest, most ordinary things. Please, a young boy from a quiet farm in Yorkshire would whisper directly into a seashell half buried near his face. Please, just let me see the old oak tree at the end of our lane again. I just want to sit on the porch and watch the rain. Just once more. Beside him, a man in his 30s, a schoolteacher who had traded his chalk for a rifle, pressed his lips to the damp sand. Keep her safe, he murmured, thinking not of himself, but of his wife sitting by the radio in their small, brick-terraced house. If I am meant to stay on this beach, please make sure the neighbor helps her fix the leak in the roof before winter comes. They poured their private fears and their deepest loves directly into the soil of France. The sand absorbed their tears, their breathless whispers, and the frantic, hammering rhythm of their hearts. It was a profound, deeply personal communion with the earth, a desperate holding on to the quiet lives they were terrified of losing. When the body is forced to lie perfectly still while the world above feels like it is tearing apart, the mind must find a place to retreat. And so, the men built invisible fortresses in their memories. Lying in the dunes, showered with pale dust, they closed their eyes and walked through the front doors of their homes. A quiet clerk from a bustling city street meticulously reconstructed his Sunday routine in his mind. He imagined the exact, comforting weight of the weekend newspaper in his hands. He visualized the steam rising from a porcelain cup of tea, perfectly brewed, sitting on a lace doily on the kitchen table. He could smell the roasted potatoes, he could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. He walked through every room of his house, touching the imaginary furniture, straightening the imaginary pictures on the wall. By building this gentle, detailed world in his mind, he built a shield against the overwhelming noise and terror of the beach. Others composed letters they had no paper to write on and no postbox to send from. "My dearest mother," a young soldier thought, his hands gripping the roots of a tuft of dune grass to keep from shaking. "I am lying on the beach right now. It is very sandy, and my uniform is quite a mess. I am sorry about that. You always told me to keep my collar clean. But I am keeping my head down, just as you told me to do when the thunder rolled in off the moors. I am wearing the thick socks you knitted. They are keeping me very warm. I am entirely safe, so please, do not worry your heart." These silent letters were acts of profound psychological resilience. They were a way of reaching across the water, of holding a conversation with the people who grounded them, proving to themselves that they were still human beings with homes, and names, and people who loved them, rather than just anonymous figures hiding in the dirt. In the long, agonizing minutes when the sky was angry, the true nature of their brotherhood revealed itself in the smallest, most heartbreakingly gentle gestures. If a boy began to tremble too violently, unable to control the shivering of his own terrified frame, the man lying next to him would not speak. Words were useless against the whistling wind. Instead, the man would simply reach out his hand, his fingernails caked in wet sand, and lay it firmly over the trembling boy's hand. He would press down, a heavy, steadying weight of solidarity. "I am right here," the touch said. "You are not alone in the dark. We are holding the earth together." Sometimes, a soldier who had lost his own helmet in the long retreat would feel a shadow fall over him, only to realize that the man beside him had shifted closer, angling his own tin hat to partially cover the exposed head of his neighbor. It was a quiet, instinctive sharing of an incredibly fragile shield. They were strangers, born in different counties, raised with different accents, but here, pressed into the glass-like sand, they breathed in perfect, synchronized rhythm, an unbroken tapestry of human care. Even the stray dogs that roamed the dunes, lost and frightened by the unnatural noises of the sky, found sanctuary in these moments. A soldier, his own heart pounding, would lift the edge of his heavy wool overcoat, gently coaxing a shivering terrier against his chest. He would wrap his arms around the animal, burying his face in its fur, finding a mutual, unspoken comfort in the simple, steady heartbeat of another living creature. When the shadows finally passed and the mechanical whistling faded back into a distant, harmless hum, the beach did not erupt in cheers. The return to safety was as quiet and tentative as a deer stepping out from the tree line. Slowly, the dunes would begin to move. A head would lift cautiously, sand falling from its hair like pale snow. A shoulder would shift. A man would push himself up onto his knees, blinking against the sudden brightness of the sun. They rose like ghosts returning from the earth, their uniforms completely coated in a fine, gray powder, their faces painted in masks of dust, with only their eyes shining through, bright and incredibly weary. There was a surreal calmness to the aftermath. The men would sit up, taking deep, shuddering breaths of the sea air, letting the scent of ozone and kelp wash the dust from their lungs. They would begin the slow, methodical task of brushing the sand from their coats. They patted each other's shoulders, knocking the loose earth free in small, silent clouds. "You all right, mate?" A voice would ask softly, passing a tin cup. Right as rain, the answer would come, a gentle, understated lie that they all understood and accepted. They would comb the grit from their hair with their fingers. They would spit the sand from their teeth. It was everywhere, in the seams of their pockets, inside their boots, deeply ingrained in the very fabric of their lives. The dunes had offered them a fragile sanctuary, but the beach had also claimed a piece of them, leaving its mark in the form of this inescapable, pale dust. And then, the quiet waiting game would resume. They would sit back down on the sand they had just prayed to, pulling their knees to their chests, looking back out over the gray, rolling water. The sun would begin to dip lower in the sky, casting long, peaceful shadows across the dunes. The wind would whisper through the tall grass, erasing the frantic marks of their digging, smoothing the beach back into a picture of serene, untouched beauty. They had survived the sky once again. They had pressed themselves into the sands of glass, they had held onto their memories and onto each other, and they had endured the crushing, psychological weight of the weight. They were exhausted, they were covered in the dust of a crumbling world, but as the evening tide began to gently wash against the shore, they were still breathing. And in the quiet, fading light of the beach, simply breathing was the most beautiful, triumphant act of heroism of all. In the deepest shadows of the fractured world, true grace was found not in the grip of a rifle, but in the gentle unfolding of a clean, white bandage. Away from the sprawling dunes and the cold, restless edge of the sea, a different kind of quiet waiting was taking place. Hidden beneath the ruined architecture of the coastal towns, down in the cool, chalky cellars of abandoned French villas, or beneath the heavy, snapping canvas of military tents erected hastily in the sand, small sanctuaries of profound humanity had been built. These were not the bright, sterile halls of modern hospitals. They were makeshift wards, carved out of the darkness and the dust, illuminated only by the soft, trembling, amber glow of paraffin lanterns and stubby, melting candles. Stepping into one of these dimly lit spaces was like stepping out of the raging storm and into the quiet, hushed nave of a forgotten church. The booming of the outside world was muffled here, replaced by the soft, rhythmic sounds of healing. It was the sound of water gently splashing into tin basins. The quiet tearing of linen. The soft squeak of rubber-soled shoes moving swiftly over stone floors. And beneath it all, the continuous, low murmur of soothing voices, offering gentle reassurances in the dark. The air in these cellars was heavy, but it was not the terrifying heaviness of the retreating march. It was thick with the sharp, clean scent of iodine, the metallic tang of damp wool, and the deeply comforting aroma of sweet, boiling tea. It was an atmosphere built entirely on the promise of care. The architects of this sanctuary were the medics, the orderlies, and the nurses. They were ordinary men and women who had carried their heavy canvas satchels through the exact same terrifying retreat as the soldiers they now tended. Their own uniforms were stained with the chalky dust of the French roads. Their own eyes were heavy with a sleep deprivation so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing down on their shoulders. They had not rested for days. Their feet ached, their hands were raw from the cold water, and their own private fears whispered quietly in the backs of their minds. Yet, when they stepped beside a canvas stretcher or knelt on the hard stone floor beside a wounded boy, all of their own exhaustion miraculously vanished. They moved with a slow, deliberate tenderness, a beautiful and deliberate counter-rhythm to the chaos that had broken them in. When a soldier was carried into the dim light of the cellar, he was often trembling, entirely lost in the terrifying echoes of his own mind. He was covered in the grime of the long march, his face masked in the pale gray dust of the dunes, his uniform stiff with the salt of the sea. The caregivers did not see a broken soldier, they saw a son, a brother, a frightened boy who simply needed to be held by the earth once more. The healing always began with the water. A nurse, her face cast in soft shadows by the flickering hurricane lamp, would dip a simple cotton cloth into a basin of warm, soapy water. She would wring it out with tired but incredibly gentle hands. Then, with a touch as light as a falling leaf, she would press the warm cloth to the boy's feverish forehead. She would slowly, methodically wash away the dust of the road. She would wipe the grit from his closed eyelids, smooth the damp hair back from his brow, and trace the contours of his cheeks until the mask of the war was entirely gone, revealing the innocent, youthful face beneath. This simple act of washing was a profound baptism of comfort. It was a silent message passed from her hands to his weary soul, saying, "You have arrived. You do not need to walk anymore. Let go of the heavy world. I will carry it for you now." And the boys would surrender. You could see the exact moment the tension left their bodies. Their shoulders would finally drop against the canvas stretcher. Their breathing would slow, syncing with the gentle, rhythmic motions of the nurse's hands. Then came the delicate art of the bandages. There was a mesmerizing, poetic grace in the way the medics handled the long strips of white gauze. They did not rush. They unwound the clean linen with a quiet reverence, wrapping it around an injured arm or a bruised shoulder with an encompassing, protective warmth. It was a physical embrace made of cotton and care. As they wound the bandages, smoothing down the edges with their thumbs, they maintained a continuous, soft patter of conversation. It was a mother's voice, a father's gentle reassurance, speaking the universal language of comfort. "There you are, my brave lad," a medic with graying hair would whisper, his voice a low, gravelly hum in the candlelight. "That's got it. Just a little snug, to keep you safe. You're doing beautifully. Just rest your eyes now. The worst of it is far behind you." These words were a powerful medicine all their own. The wounded men drank them in, clinging to the calm, steady timbre of the caregivers' voices. The world outside might have been vast and terrifying, but inside the small, golden circle of the lantern light, there was only safety. There was only the gentle touch of a hand that sought to mend, rather than to break. In the deepest hours of the night, when the pain sometimes pushed through the exhaustion and the shadows grew long on the cellar walls, the true psychological heroism of the nurses quietly blossomed. They were not just mending the physical body, they were holding together fragile, frightened minds. A young soldier, his hands heavily wrapped in clean white cotton, lay staring at the low stone ceiling. His chest rose and fell in shallow, anxious breaths. He could not sleep, because to close his eyes was to return to the deafening noise of the retreat. A young nurse, noticing the fast, frightened flutter of his eyelids, pulled an overturned wooden crate to the side of his stretcher and sat down. She did not ask him where it hurt. She simply placed her cool hand over his bandaged one, offering the solid, undeniable weight of her presence. "I can't write to her," the boy whispered into the dark, his voice cracking with a sorrow he had held inside for 100 miles. "My wife. I promised I'd write her every Sunday. And my hands." The nurse offered a soft, understanding smile that he could feel even if he could barely see it in the dim light. She reached into the deep pocket of her apron and produced a small, worn nub of a pencil and a folded piece of paper she had been saving for just such a moment. "Tell me what you want to say," she whispered, smoothing the paper across her knee. "I will be your hands tonight." And so, in the quiet, flickering dark of the makeshift ward, a beautiful, shared intimacy unfolded. The boy stared at the ceiling, letting his mind travel across the black water, back to the small kitchen in a town he missed with a visceral ache. He spoke in a hushed, hesitant voice, and the nurse's pencil scratched softly against the paper, capturing his love in graphite. "My darling Mary," she wrote, her handwriting neat and looping, pouring her own calm energy into the shapes of the letters. "I am safe. I am resting in a quiet place, and the people here are very kind to me. My hands are a bit bruised from the work, so a lovely nurse is writing this for me. I am drinking a cup of tea, and I am thinking of the way the sun looks when it hits the front window of our house." The nurse purposefully left out the damp chill of the cellar, the booming in the distance, and the terrifying uncertainty of the morning. She acted as a filter, catching the darkness and letting only the pure, golden light of his love flow onto the page. She was offering him the profound dignity of keeping his promise. When she finished, she folded the paper carefully and slipped it into the breast pocket of his tunic, right over his heart. "It's safe there," she whispered, giving his shoulder a final, gentle squeeze. "Just until we get you home." The boy closed his eyes, a profound peace settling over his features, and for the first time in weeks, he drifted into a deep, untroubled slumber. These quiet moments of grace happened over and over again in the dim light. A medic holding a tin cup of sweetened tea to the lips of a man too weak to lift his head, murmuring softly as the warm liquid brought the color back to his pale cheeks. An orderly sharing his very last, carefully hoarded cigarette, placing it gently between the lips of a wounded stranger, lighting it with a cupped match so the brief flare would not hurt the man's tired eyes. The caregivers absorbed the sorrow and the fear of 1,000 broken boys, acting as deep, quiet wells of endless compassion. They witnessed the tearing apart of the world, yet they stubbornly, beautifully insisted on stitching it back together, one small, quiet act of kindness at a time. As the long night wore on, the cellar would finally settle into a profound, collective quiet. The pain had been managed, the fears had been soothed, and the heavy, sweet blanket of sleep finally fell over the wounded. The room was filled with the soft, synchronized sound of deep breathing, a chorus of men who finally felt safe enough to let down their guard. Through this sleeping sanctuary, the nurses and medics continued to move. They were like gentle, watchful ghosts floating through the amber light. They walked softly, mindful of their heavy shoes on the stone. They paused beside each stretcher, just for a moment. They would pull a rough wool blanket a little higher over a sleeping shoulder to keep out the sea chill. They would gently adjust a bandaged limb so it rested more softly on a folded tunic. They would touch the back of their hand to a forehead one last time, checking the temperature of a sleeping boy. They did not sit down. They did not close their own aching eyes. They stood watch in the dark, their aprons stained, their hands smelling of iodine and soap, their hearts full of a quiet, enduring love for these strangers. In the vast, overwhelming sweep of history, it is easy to look only at the great ships and the dark skies. But the truest beauty of those long nights was found here, in the dim, flickering light of the cellars. It was found in the unwavering, quiet resilience of the men and women who stayed awake so that others might finally sleep. They were the gentle guardians of the dark, proving that even when the world breaks apart, there will always be hands that reach out through the shadows, soft, steady, and endlessly kind, to bind the broken pieces back together. To save a world that is falling apart, someone must willingly stand in the open doorway and hold back the dark. While the great, exhausted tide of humanity flowed steadily toward the sprawling sands and the promise of the sea, there were those who were asked to stop walking. There were the men who stepped out of the long, dusty columns and moved to the edges of the road, becoming the quiet, unmoving stones in a river of retreating brothers. They were given an order that was not shouted over the roar of the crumbling landscape, but passed softly from man to man in the fading twilight. It was a simple request, carrying the heaviest weight a human heart can bear. They were asked to turn around, to put their backs to the ocean, and to hold the line. There is a profound, almost unimaginable grace in watching salvation walk away from you and choosing to stay behind. These men of the rearguard were not fashioned from iron or stone. They were exactly the same as the boys huddled on the beaches. They were bakers from quiet villages, schoolteachers with ink-stained fingers, and young farmhands who missed the smell of the damp earth of home. They felt the exact same bone-deep exhaustion, the exact same piercing ache of homesickness, and the exact same quiet terror of the gathering storm. Yet, when the moment came, they simply nodded. They tightened the canvas straps of their heavy packs, they rested their hands on the cool wood of their rifles, and they stepped into the shadows so that others might step into the light. The perimeter they were asked to hold was not a grand fortress. It was a fragile ribbon of ancient, winding canals, shattered brick farmhouses, and sleepy cobblestone streets in towns whose names they could barely pronounce. They moved into these quiet, abandoned spaces with a gentle reverence, making temporary homes in the ruins. They dug shallow trenches in the soft, spring grass, the soil yielding easily to their spades, smelling of rain and crushed clover. They stacked fallen bricks in the window frames of old cottages, moving softly, as if trying not to wake the ghosts of the families who had so recently fled. In these quiet preparations, a beautiful, solemn peace began to settle over them. The frantic, confusing anxiety of the long retreat simply washed away, leaving behind a crystal-clear, profound sense of purpose. When you know entirely what is asked of you, even if the asking is terrible, the mind stops racing. They looked at the men beside them, strangers who had become brothers in the dust, and a silent, unbreakable covenant was formed in the fading light. There was no need for grand speeches about glory or nation. The heroism here was small, intimate, and impossibly tender. It was the sharing of the very last tin of peaches, carefully divided into equal, golden portions on the blade of a pocket knife. It was a hand reaching out to gently brush the chalky dust from a friend's shoulder. It was the quiet, shared understanding that their standing still was buying the most precious commodity in the world, time. Every minute they held their ground was another minute for a boy on the beach to find a boat. Every hour they remained in the shadows was another son, another father, another husband sailing safely back to the white cliffs. As the long columns of their retreating comrades passed through their lines, heading for the dunes, the most heartbreaking and beautiful exchanges took place in the quiet spaces between the marching boots. A soldier from the rearguard, leaning against a low stone wall, would call out softly to a friend passing by in the weary procession. He would reach into the breast pocket of his wool tunic, pulling out a folded piece of paper, softened by the damp air and marked with the dirt of the road. "Take this for me, Tommy," he would whisper, his voice steady and remarkably calm. "Take this to my Mary. Tell her the tulips need pruning in the autumn. And tell her I kept my promise to be brave." The passing soldier would take the letter with trembling hands, tucking it safely over his own heart. He would look into the eyes of his friend, seeing the quiet acceptance residing there, and he would nod, unable to speak through the sudden, heavy lump in his throat. He would reach out, grasping his friend's shoulder in a tight, lingering grip, a touch that communicated a lifetime of gratitude and sorrow in a single, silent second. Watches were unclasped from wrists and handed over in the dark. Faded photographs of smiling children were pressed into the palms of men heading for the water. "Give this to my boy," a father would murmur, his eyes shining in the twilight. "Tell him it belonged to a man who loved him more than the whole world." They were divesting themselves of their earthly anchors, sending their loves, their memories, and their quiet hopes forward, while they themselves remained tethered to the foreign soil. They were ensuring that even if their bodies could not cross the channel, their hearts would make the journey home. When the last of the columns had passed, and the roads behind them grew completely empty, a profound and heavy silence fell over the perimeter. The men of the rearguard were entirely alone now. The vast, gray expanse of the sea, which had been their guiding star for so many agonizing miles, was now hidden behind the rolling dunes and the gathering mist. They would not feel the salt spray on their faces. They would not hear the gentle, lulling sound of the little ships putting out their wooden gangways. Instead, they listened to the wind rustling through the reeds of the canals. They listened to the slow, rhythmic breathing of the men lying in the grass beside them. As night descended, painting the sky in deep, bruised shades of violet and charcoal, they settled into their positions, wrapping their heavy coats tightly against the creeping chill. In the dark, the quiet fears that they had pushed away during the day came back to visit, gentle and persistent. A young boy, barely old enough to shave, lay on his back looking up at the scatter of brilliant, icy stars. He wondered if his mother was looking at the exact same stars through the kitchen window. He felt a sudden, sharp ache of longing, not for survival, but just for the simple comfort of his own bed, the smell of lavender soap, and the soft ticking of the clock in the hall. The older man lying next to him in the shallow trench heard the boy's breath hitch in the dark. He did not say a word. He simply reached out his hand, resting it firmly over the boy's trembling fingers. He squeezed gently, a steady, warm pressure that anchored the boy to the earth. "I am here," the touch whispered. "We are together. You do not have to carry the night alone." And the boy squeezed back, his breathing slowing, the sharp edge of his fear softening into the quiet, shared resilience of the dark. They found comfort in the smallest, most fleeting things. The brief, warm flare of a match shared behind a cupped hand to light a single, precious cigarette. The smell of the tobacco mingling with the damp grass. The memory of a favorite song, hummed so softly it was almost indistinguishable from the wind. They built a fortress not of brick or steel, but of memory, of love, and of an unshakable devotion to the brothers they had watched walk away. They knew the storm was coming for them. They could feel the vibration of it in the earth beneath their chests. They could hear the distant, mechanical thunder rolling across the dark horizon. But they did not run. They did not abandon their quiet posts by the bridges and the broken walls. They lay in the spring grass, entirely still, holding the fragile edge of the world together with nothing but their own quiet courage. To be the rearguard is to accept the shadows so that others may walk in the sun. It is a sacrifice so pure, so incredibly devoid of ego, that it transcends the very nature of conflict. These men were not fighting for territory, or for flags, or for the grand, sweeping ideologies of nations. They were fighting simply for the boy standing next to them, and for the thousands of boys currently wading into the freezing surf miles behind their backs. They were giving everything they had, their tomorrows, their homecomings, the gentle unspooling of their natural lives, so that an armada of tiny, wooden boats could slip away into the mist. As the night stretched on, the solemn peace that had settled over them deepened into a state of quiet grace. They were no longer simply soldiers, they were the guardians of the tide. When they looked up at the stars, they did not ask for rescue. They simply asked that the water be calm. They asked that the little boats be swift. They asked that the letters they had handed away in the twilight would safely reach the mantelpieces and the kitchen tables of the homes they would never see again. And as the first, pale light of dawn began to creep over the edge of the world, illuminating the ruined farmhouses and the silver ribbons of the canals, the men of the rearguard did not look back toward the sea. They kept their faces turned toward the east. They checked the actions of their rifles one last time, they brushed the dew from their coats, and they waited in the quiet morning, standing tall and beautifully unbroken in the shadow of their duty. They were the immovable stones. They were the anchor in the deep. And in their quiet, magnificent stillness, they gave the world the greatest, most enduring gift of all. They gave it the chance to begin again. To touch the water was to finally surrender the heavy earth, stepping blindly into the freezing, dark embrace of the sea. For days, the ocean had been a distant promise, a flat, gray line drawn across the horizon that meant everything and nothing at all. They had stared at it from the high dunes, letting the salt spray cool their feverish faces, dreaming of the ships that would come to carry them away. But as the mist began to part and the shadows of the little boats finally materialized in the shallows, a quiet, terrifying realization washed over the waiting men. The water here was too thin. The sandbanks were too shallow for the boats to reach the dry beach. To find salvation, the boys would have to walk out into the deep. They stood at the water's edge, hesitating just for a moment, listening to the gentle, rhythmic shhhh, shhhh of the small waves breaking over the shells. They unfastened the heavy brass buckles of their canvas webbing, letting their ammunition pouches and their heavy steel helmets fall softly onto the wet sand. They were shedding the armor of the war, stripping themselves down to the absolute essentials of survival. They kept only the clothes on their backs, the faded photographs tucked carefully into their breast pockets, and the quiet, desperate hope beating in their chests. And then, with a collective, shuddering breath, they took the first step. The initial shock of the English Channel was a physical blow. The water was not just cold, it was a biting, ancient freezing that seemed to bypass the skin entirely and settle directly into the bones. It seized the muscles in their calves and stole the breath from their lungs, turning their quiet whispers into sharp, involuntary gasps. But they did not stop. They pushed forward, their heavy leather boots sinking into the shifting, uncertain sand of the seabed. With every step they took away from the shore, the water rose. It climbed past their knees, the heavy wool of their trousers instantly soaking through and wrapping around their legs like lead weights. The uniforms that had kept them warm in the spring fields now became terrible anchors, trying to pull them down into the dark. It required a monumental, exhausting effort just to lift one foot and place it in front of the other, fighting against the gentle but relentless pull of the tide. When the water reached their waists, the sheer vastness of the sea began to press in on them. They were no longer soldiers marching on a road, they were fragile, floating things, entirely at the mercy of the current. To keep from being swept away, they reached out in the dark. Hands found shoulders, arms linked through arms. They formed long, shivering human chains stretching out from the shore, a delicate lifeline woven from exhausted bodies and quiet trust. Taller men, whose heads remained safely above the swells, gently wrapped their arms around the waists of the shorter boys, lifting them up when the waves rolled in, acting as living pillars against the sea. They leaned into one another, sharing their meager body heat, their teeth chattering in a synchronized, percussive rhythm that became the only sound in the world. In this freezing, suspended state, the mind clung fiercely to the smallest, most fragile talismans of home. A young corporal, the water lapping dangerously close to his chin, held one arm stiffly above his head. His fingers were completely numb, locked in a painful, rigid grip around a small, leather-bound diary. Inside its pages were the pressed petals of a violet his wife had given him on the platform of the railway station, and the unfinished letter he had been writing to her in his mind for 100 miles. He did not care about the cold creeping up his spine, or the exhaustion burning in his thighs. He only cared about keeping that small piece of his heart dry, holding it up to the sky like a silent, desperate prayer. The distance to the boats was agonizingly slow to close. The little wooden vessels bobbed in the mist ahead, their small engines puttering with a soft, domestic hum that sounded like a lullaby against the vast emptiness of the channel. Through the gray haze, the men in the water could finally see the faces of the people waiting for them. They were not military captains in crisp uniforms. They were ordinary men leaning dangerously far over the wooden gunwales, their faces etched with deep concern and quiet determination. They wore tweed caps pulled low, thick, knitted fishermen's sweaters, and heavy rubber aprons. They were the bakers, the bank clerks, and the fathers who had sailed through the night, bringing the warmth of the English countryside directly into the freezing surf. As the shivering chain of boys finally reached the sides of the little ships, the true, profound weight of human connection was forged. A young soldier, his lips entirely blue, his eyes wide with a quiet, exhausted terror, found himself bobbing beside the hull of a small pleasure cruiser. The wooden side of the boat seemed impossibly high, a sheer, painted cliff rising out of the water. His arms, waterlogged and frozen, refused to lift. He simply stared up at the man looking down at him, a silent plea written in the trembling lines of his face. "I have come as far as I can," the look said. "I cannot do the rest." And the man in the boat understood. He was a retired butcher from Kent, a man with broad, heavy shoulders and hands that were rough and calloused from a lifetime of quiet labor. He did not hesitate. He leaned his torso over the wooden edge, reaching down into the freezing water, plunging his own warm arms into the channel up to his elbows. "I've got you, son," the man whispered, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that cut through the sound of the splashing waves. "I've got you. Just hold on." The physical contact was electric. The freezing, numb fingers of the soldier locked around the thick, warm wool of the civilian's sleeve. The butcher's hands, strong and incredibly gentle, gripped the boy firmly by the thick canvas webbing of his suspenders. There was a moment of profound, suspended gravity. The butcher braced his knees against the inside of his boat, he closed his eyes, and with a quiet, grunting exertion, he pulled. He pulled with the strength of a father pulling his own child from the fire. He took the entire, waterlogged weight of a broken boy, the heavy, soaked wool, the boots filled with sand, the exhaustion, the fear, and the sorrow, and he simply lifted it into the air. The soldier felt the water release its icy grip. He felt himself rising over the wooden rail, entirely weightless for a single, miraculous second, before he tumbled softly onto the dry, varnished floorboards of the deck. The sound of his wet uniform slapping against the wood was the sound of a world saved. He lay there on his back, staring up at the gray sky, his chest heaving as he gasped for the sweet, clean air. He could feel the solid, unyielding reality of the timber beneath him. He was no longer floating. He was held. The butcher did not ask him his name, or what he had seen in the ruined towns, or how many miles he had walked. He simply knelt beside the shivering boy and draped a thick, dry, plaid blanket over his trembling shoulders, tucking the edges in with a mother's tender care. He handed the boy a tin cup filled with sweet, lukewarm tea from a thermos, his rough thumb lightly brushing against the boy's freezing knuckles. In that quiet, domestic space, surrounded by the smell of diesel oil, old rope, and the lingering scent of pipe tobacco, the emotional dam finally broke. The tears came silently, unbidden and unstoppable. They slipped from the corners of the soldier's closed eyes, tracing warm, clean paths through the mask of gray dust and dried sea salt on his cheeks. There were tears of an exhaustion so deep it felt like a hollow cavern in his chest. There were tears of a profound, unimaginable grief for the brothers he had left behind in the spring grass. But mostly, they were tears of an overwhelming, pure gratitude. He did not need to hide his weeping, because his face was already dripping with the channel. The seawater and the tears mingled together, indistinguishable from one another, washed away by the gentle hand of the man who had pulled him from the deep. All around them, this beautiful, desperate ballet of salvation was repeating itself over and over in the mist. Dozens of small boats, rising and falling on the swells, were surrounded by reaching hands. The civilians hauled the soldiers over the sides like precious, fragile cargo. They pulled until their own backs ached, until their own hands were blistered and bleeding from the ropes, until the small wooden decks were packed tightly with shivering, wrapped figures. There were no ranks here, no salutes, no military protocols. There was only the profound grace of one human being refusing to let another slip into the dark. A bank manager held a frightened teenager tightly against his chest, rocking him gently as the boy sobbed into his coat. A fisherman carefully unlaced the sand-filled boots of a sergeant, massaging the feeling back into the man's frozen toes. They offered everything they had, their dry coats, their sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, their quiet, soothing voices, and the immense, comforting weight of their presence. As the little ship slowly turned its bow away from the shoreline, pointing back toward the invisible cliffs of home, the rescued men huddled together under the blankets. They leaned against the wooden sides of the cabin, their bodies still shivering, but their minds finally beginning to quiet. They looked back at the water they had just conquered. The channel looked different now. It was no longer a terrifying, insurmountable barrier. It was simply a body of water, and they were resting safely on top of it. They listened to the rhythmic, steady thrumming of the civilian engine, a sound that promised forward motion, a sound that promised tomorrow. The boy with the leather diary slowly uncurled his frozen fingers. He opened the cover just a fraction of an inch, ensuring the pages were still dry, before pressing it gently against his heart. He closed his eyes, feeling the slow, rocking motion of the boat, a gentle cradle suspended over the deep. He felt the rough wool of the blanket, the lingering warmth of the tea in his chest, and the lingering memory of the strong, reaching hand that had pulled him from the edge. He was entirely exhausted, stripped of everything but his life, but as the little ship glided softly into the mist, he knew that he was finally, miraculously, safe. And in the quiet hum of the engine, the sea began to sing a gentle lullaby, carrying the broken boys home. Once the heavy, sand-filled boots finally left the broken earth, the soul was free to simply rest. The transition from the terrifying expanse of the open beach to the enclosed, wooden sanctuary of the little ships was a shift so profound it felt like passing through a veil into another world. As the small civilian engines hummed to life, coughing soft plumes of white exhaust into the mist, the gap of dark water between the painted hulls and the shoreline began to widen. With every passing second, the booming echoes of the falling sky and the frantic, chaotic energy of the dunes faded further into the background, replaced entirely by the immediate, intimate sounds of salvation. It was the rhythmic, hollow thud, thud, thud of the small motors. It was the gentle, washing sound of the waves peeling away from the wooden bows. And it was the collective, shuddering exhale of dozens of men simultaneously realizing that they no longer had to run. On the narrow decks, down in the cramped, varnished cabins, and huddled in the open fishing holds, the exhausted soldiers began to collapse. This was not the sudden, painful dropping of men on a forced march. It was a slow, graceful folding into the deck. Their bodies, which had been coiled tight with adrenaline and quiet terror for so many days, finally received the silent permission to let go. Muscles that had locked themselves against the cold and the fear began to soften, unspooling like tightly wound watch springs. They sat shoulder to shoulder, back to chest, filling every available inch of the small vessels. There was no space to stretch out, no room to pace, and no one cared. The very tightness of their quarters was a profound comfort. After being so terribly exposed under the vast, dangerous canopy of the sky, to be pressed firmly against the warm, breathing bodies of their brothers was the only armor they desired. As the little ships pushed deeper into the dark, rolling channel, the sea itself seemed to recognize the fragility of its cargo. The water, which had been so freezing and hostile during their desperate wade from the shore, now transformed into a gentle, swaying cradle. The boats rose slowly on the swells, hovering for a weightless second at the crest, before sinking softly into the dark, velvety troughs. Up and down. Side to side. It was a mesmerizing, ancient rhythm. To the men lying on the floorboards, their heavy heads resting on canvas packs or simply against the wet wool of a neighbor's shoulder, the motion was a deeply familiar lullaby. It felt exactly like the comforting, rocking embrace of a mother sitting by a nursery window in the dead of night. The creaking of the ship's timber sounded like the familiar groaning of an old wooden rocking chair, a domestic, soothing sound that chased the lingering phantoms from their minds. Under this hypnotic sway, the men surrendered to a sleep deeper than any they had ever known. It was not a restless slumber filled with tossing and turning. It was a profound, absolute stillness. The mind, having witnessed the unraveling of the world, mercifully threw a heavy, velvet curtain over their consciousness. There were no nightmares here on the water. There were no flashing lights or whistling sounds echoing in their dreams. There was only a blank, warm, heavy nothingness. They slept with their mouths slightly open, their breathing slow, deep, and beautifully synchronized with the rising and falling of the tide. In this sprawling, tangled mass of sleeping men, the rigid structures of the world they had left behind completely dissolved. The brass buttons and stitched stripes that denoted rank were hidden beneath shared blankets and the shadows of the night. A decorated officer with silver at his temples slept with his head resting gently on the knee of a young, soot-stained private who had been a grocer's boy just weeks before. A man from the bustling streets of London was curled protectively around a quiet farmhand from the Scottish Highlands, sharing the meager warmth of a single, damp overcoat. They were no longer an army. They were simply a fragile collection of human beings, bound together by the quiet miracle of having survived. Moving silently among these sleeping shapes were the civilian crews, the ordinary men who had steered their weekend yachts and fishing smacks directly into the fire. Now that the frantic hauling of bodies from the surf was over, they assumed a new, gentle role. They became the quiet shepherds of the dark. A retired schoolmaster, his hand still trembling slightly from the adrenaline of the shoreline, tied the wheel of his small cruiser in place for a moment. He stepped softly over the tangle of legs and boots, carrying a rough tartan blanket he had brought from his own sofa back in Kent. He knelt beside a young boy who was shivering in his sleep, his uniform still soaked with the freezing channel water. With movements as careful as if he were handling spun glass, the schoolmaster draped the blanket over the boy, tucking the edges tightly under the wet shoulders to trap the heat. He lingered for a moment, gently brushing a stray lock of damp, salt-crusted hair away from the boy's closed eyes. Sleep now, lad, he whispered into the sea breeze, a soft incantation of peace. I've got the watch. You just rest. From the tiny, makeshift galleys below deck, the smell of sweet, scalding tea wafted up into the night air, mingling with the scent of diesel fuel, wet wool, and old rope. It was a deeply grounding aroma. Occasionally, a soldier would stir, pulled halfway from his slumber by the comforting smell or a sudden, cold spray of sea mist over the bow. Before the cold could truly wake him, a chipped enamel mug would appear in his line of sight, held by the rough, steady hand of a civilian sailor. The soldier would sit up just enough to wrap his numb fingers around the warm tin. He would take a single, slow sip of the sugary liquid, feeling the heat trace a bright, golden line down into his chest. He would meet the eyes of the man who handed it to him, offering a slow, heavy blink of gratitude, before handing the mug back and sinking instantly into the dark, comforting sleep once more. There was no need for conversation. The silence on the boats was sacred, broken only by the mechanical heartbeat of the engines and the sighing of the wind through the rigging. The men in the wheelhouses kept their eyes fixed on the distant, invisible horizon, navigating by the faint light of the stars and the gentle pull of the magnetic compass. They felt the immense, precious weight of the lives resting on their floorboards. They steered with a fierce, quiet devotion, doing everything in their power to keep the boat steady, to avoid jarring the hull against a sudden wave, desperate not to break the fragile spell of sleep that had fallen over their passengers. As the deepest hours of the night stretched on, the terrible glow of the burning coastline finally faded from the sky behind them, replaced by the cool, encompassing dark of the open sea. The air grew crisper, cleaner, entirely washed of the dust and the ash of the ruined continent. For the boys sleeping on the decks, the journey across the water was a suspension of time. They were floating in a quiet limbo between the nightmare they had escaped and the home they were praying to reach. They did not have to march. They did not have to hide. They only had to exist, breathing in the salt air, letting the rhythmic thrum of the engine massage the terrible ache from their bones. In the quiet architecture of their resting minds, the broken pieces of their spirits slowly began to knit themselves back together. The sea was washing them clean. The gentle, side-to-side rocking of the channel was a physical reminder that they were held, that they were cared for, and that the world had not entirely given itself over to the dark. Every creak of the timber, every splash of the bow breaking a wave, was a whisper of tomorrow. The little ships were not just carrying them across a body of water, they were carrying them across the threshold of a second chance. And so, the exhausted boys surrendered their weight entirely to the wooden planks. They folded themselves into the shadows and the blankets, trusting the ordinary, extraordinary men at the helms, and allowed themselves to be rocked, gently and endlessly, by the deep. To leave the world is frightening, but to stand on the very edge of your own home, waiting for a stranger's boat to carry you away from it, is a uniquely quiet kind of heartbreak. For the boys who had crossed the channel weeks before, the sprawling, windswept dunes were a foreign landscape. The sand was simply the final, exhausting hurdle between the fires of the retreat and the safety of their island. They looked out at the rolling gray water, and they saw a pathway home. But for the thousands of French soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder with them in the mist, the geography of the heart was entirely different. The sand beneath their heavy, tired boots was not just earth, it was France. It was the soil of their ancestors. The salty breeze blowing in off the waves carried the faint, familiar scent of the seaside towns they had known since childhood, of Sunday holidays, and the sweet, buttery smell of bakeries that now lay quiet and empty just a few miles down the coast. They were not waiting to go home. They were waiting to leave it, stepping into a profound and uncertain exile so that they might live to see their country breathe again. Along the vast, crowded stretches of the beach, the fading colors of the Allied coats mingled together in a beautiful, somber tapestry. The dusty khaki of the retreating islanders blended with the heavy, mud-stained olive and faded horizon blue of the French defenders. They were two great rivers of exhausted men, pushed to the very edge of the map by the same relentless storm, now gathered in the shared sanctuary of the shore. Between these men, there was a vast, silent gulf built of language. They did not share the same words for fear, or for cold, or for the desperate longing for a warm bed. A boy from the misty, cobblestone streets of London could not easily speak to the farmer from the sun-drenched lavender fields of Provence. If they tried to converse, their sentences would tangle in confusion, lost in the heavy sea wind. Yet, in the profound, stripping exhaustion of the beach, they discovered that the most important conversations require no words at all. They communicated in the universal, gentle language of survival. When a bitter gust of wind whipped across the dunes, carrying a shower of stinging, pale sand, a British soldier would instinctively lean his shoulder against the back of the French rifleman sitting in front of him, offering his own body as a fragile windbreak. The French soldier would not turn around to offer a translated word of thanks. He would simply lean back into the warmth, letting his heavy head rest for a fleeting moment against the wool of his ally's coat, a silent, profound acknowledgement of the grace he had just been given. They sat in quiet, mixed circles in the hollows of the dunes, their knees drawn to their chests. When a canteen was miraculously produced, its painted metal chipped and dented from the long, terrible roads, it was never hoarded. A French corporal, his face dark with the soot of a ruined city, would unscrew the cap with trembling fingers. He would take a meager, careful sip, letting the lukewarm water soothe his cracked lips. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he would pass it across the circle to a young, shivering boy with a different insignia on his collar. Their eyes would meet, hollow, entirely exhausted, but shining with a deep, mutual understanding. "We are the same," the glance whispered. "We are both so very thirsty, and the water belongs to us all." In these hushed circles, the deepest fears and the greatest loves were shared in complete silence. An older French infantryman, a man whose face bore the lines of a lifetime of hard, honest work in the vineyards, reached deep into the breast pocket of his heavy coat. His fingers were stiff with the sea chill, but he moved with a delicate, practiced reverence. He pulled out a small, creased photograph, its edges softened by the damp air and the constant touch of his thumb. He held it out to the young British private sitting beside him. The private leaned in, peering through the gray light of the afternoon. In the photograph, a woman in a simple, floral dress stood smiling beneath the shade of a chestnut tree, a young girl with dark braids clinging happily to her leg. The private did not know their names. He did not know the town where the picture was taken, or the sound of the little girl's laugh. But he recognized the anchor. He understood entirely what that small square of paper meant to the man holding it. The private smiled, a soft, genuine warmth breaking through the mask of dust on his face. He tapped his own chest, directly over his heart, and offered a slow, solemn nod. "Beautiful," he murmured, a word that transcended its English roots and the softness of its delivery. The French soldier nodded back, carefully returning the photograph to its resting place against his chest. He closed his eyes, and in the quiet architecture of his mind, he wrote a letter he could not send. "My dearest," he thought, listening to the rhythmic shhhh of the channel. "I am sitting at the edge of the sea. I am surrounded by strangers who have become my brothers. The air is cold, but my heart is entirely fixed on you. I must leave our beautiful country tonight, but only so that I might find my way back to you when the sky is clear again. Keep the garden gate latched. I am coming back." As they waited under the vast, unpredictable sky, a profound, quiet nobility revealed itself among the French ranks. They knew that miles behind them, in the ruined streets and the quiet, shadowed canals, their own countrymen were still standing their ground. The French rearguard was holding the crumbling perimeter, fighting with a magnificent, heartbreaking stubbornness, buying the hours with their own lives so that this mixed armada of exhausted men could reach the little boats. Carrying the immense weight of that sacrifice, the men on the beach refused to let their spirits fracture. They could not control the storm, but they could control how they stood in the rain. A French officer, his uniform torn and stained with the dark mud of the flooded lowlands, stood up in the gathering twilight. He did not pace frantically. He did not look over his shoulder at the fires burning in the distance. Instead, he simply, methodically, began to adjust his clothing. He buttoned his collar against the wind. He brushed the pale sand from the sleeves of his coat with slow, dignified strokes. He straightened his shoulders, standing tall and unbroken against the fading light. His quiet defiance rippled outward. Around him, the men of his unit began to do the same. They checked their comrades, reaching out to gently brush the dust from a neighbor's back, straightening a tilted helmet, offering a steadying hand as men rose stiffly to their feet. They were preparing to meet the sea not as a defeated army, but as men of enduring pride. They would leave their home, but they would leave it with their heads held high. When the silhouettes of the little ships finally appeared through the mist, bobbing gently on the dark, rolling swells, the true brotherhood of the blue horizon was cemented. The order to move into the water did not divide them by nation, it united them in the freezing surf. They walked into the channel together, the water rising past their boots, soaking into the heavy wool of their trousers. The sea did not care what language they spoke. The cold treated them as absolute equals. As the tide swelled, threatening to knock the exhausted men off their feet, they locked arms. The sturdy hand of a French baker gripped the wet canvas belt of a British clerk. They braced against the current, a beautiful, shivering chain of human resilience stretching out from the shore. When they reached the wooden sides of the civilian boats, they did not push or scramble. There was a solemn, unspoken courtesy in the dark. A British soldier, his hands numb and slipping on the varnished wood, felt the sudden, strong push of a French soldier lifting him from below, hoisting him over the gunwale to safety. And from the deck, the British boy immediately turned back, reaching his own trembling hand down into the darkness to pull his savior from the water. They collapsed together onto the wet floorboards, their breathing heavy, their chests heaving in perfect unison. They were soaked to the bone, shivering violently as the night air whipped across the open decks. A civilian sailor draped a single, thick wool blanket over them both. They huddled beneath it, shoulder to shoulder, pooling their fragile body heat, wrapped in the comforting, rhythmic puttering of the small engine as it turned its bow toward the open sea. As the little ship slowly pulled away from the shore, gliding into the deep, quiet expanse of the channel, the French soldiers turned their heads one last time. They looked past the breaking waves, past the empty, sprawling dunes, toward the dark, beloved shape of the coastline. The fires of the war cast a faint, bruised glow on the horizon, but above it, the sky was settling into the deep, peaceful blue of the night. It was a bittersweet, aching farewell. They were leaving the soil that had nurtured them, the streets they had walked as children, the homes where their families were still quietly waiting in the dark. A single tear, warm and heavy with sorrow, traced a clean path through the salt and the dust on a soldier's cheek. He did not wipe it away. He simply let it fall, a quiet offering to the sea. He rested his head against the wooden side of the cabin, feeling the steady, reassuring presence of the British boy sleeping beside him. They were adrift in the deep, floating between a shattered past and an unknown future. But as the familiar coastline faded into the mist, vanishing into the blue horizon, the French soldiers held onto a quiet, unbreakable promise. They had surrendered the land, but they had not surrendered their hope. They listened to the gentle lullaby of the water against the hull, drawing strength from the brothers sleeping at their sides, knowing deep in their souls that the tide always, eventually, returns to the shore. After the endless dark of the water, home announced itself not with a shout, but with a soft, pale glowing in the morning mist. The long, terrifying night upon the English Channel was slowly surrendering to the dawn. The sky, which had been a heavy canopy of bruised purple and deep, absolute black, began to soften into delicate shades of pearl and dove gray. On the wooden decks of the little ships, the exhausted men were just beginning to stir. They woke slowly, their bodies stiff and aching, pulling themselves from the deep, dreamless slumber that had held them safely across the water. They blinked against the growing light, their eyelashes heavy with dried salt, their uniforms still stiff and smelling of the sea. For a long time, there was nothing to see but the mist. It was a thick, enveloping fog that rolled over the gentle swells of the water, isolating each small boat in its own private, quiet universe. The men sat in silence, listening to the steady, rhythmic puttering of the civilian engines. They were suspended in a beautiful, surreal waiting room, caught between the nightmare they had left on the burning shores of France and the desperate hope of what lay hidden just ahead. And then, as if a gentle hand had reached down to draw back a curtain, the mist began to part. It did not happen all at once. It was a slow, teasing revelation. First, a shadow emerged high above the water, a towering silhouette painted in soft grays. The boys on the decks leaned forward, their hands gripping the varnished wooden rails, their breath catching in their throats. As the little ships pushed steadily forward and the morning sun began to burn away the fog, the shadow transformed. It was white. A brilliant, blinding, impossible white. The chalk cliffs of Dover were emerging from the mist. They stood like ancient, silent guardians rising straight out of the dark water, their sheer faces catching the early morning light. To the men looking up at them, these were not merely geological formations. They were the physical embodiment of safety. They were the magnificent, unyielding walls of home. A collective, shuddering exhale moved across the fleet of tiny boats. Men who had endured the terrifying whistle of the falling sky without a single flinch, who had marched through the dusty ruins of a crumbling world with stoic, hardened faces, suddenly found their vision blurring. The tears came quietly, slipping down their salt-crusted cheeks. They did not wipe them away. They simply stared at the cliffs, letting the sheer, overwhelming beauty of their own country wash over them. A young private from a landlocked farming village, a boy who had never seen the ocean before this terrible spring, pressed his dirty hands to his mouth. "We made it," he whispered into his palms, the words so soft they were instantly carried away by the sea breeze. "We actually made it." He looked at the white chalk and imagined the rolling green hills that lay just beyond its crest. He imagined the sheep grazing in the damp morning grass, the smoke curling from the stone chimneys of his village, the absolute, undisturbed peace of the world he loved. As the little ships rounded the final breakwater and glided into the sheltered harbor, the very texture of the water changed. The dark, rolling, unpredictable swells of the open channel surrendered to a glassy, calm green. The boats stopped their restless pitching and settled into a smooth, gentle glide. The sounds of the war, which had echoed in their minds for weeks, were finally, completely replaced by the sounds of a peaceful morning. Seagulls wheeled and cried overhead, their white wings flashing against the blue sky, swooping down to inspect the arriving armada. Small brass bells chimed on the bobbing harbor buoys. The air no longer smelled of cordite, burning oil, or the panicked sweat of the retreat. It smelled of rain-washed cobblestones, of seaweed drying on the harbor walls, and of wet, green earth. It was the sweetest, most intoxicating perfume in the world. The civilian captains, their faces deeply lined with exhaustion but glowing with a quiet, profound pride, slowly eased their wooden vessels alongside the great stone piers. The engines, which had hummed faithfully through the terrifying dark, were finally cut. The sudden silence that followed was incredibly heavy, and incredibly beautiful. Heavy mooring ropes were tossed through the air, caught by waiting hands on the dock. The boats were secured. And then came the moment the men had been dreaming of for 100 dusty miles. They stepped off the trembling, wooden decks, and placed their heavy leather boots onto the solid stone of the pier. The ground did not move. It did not sway beneath their weight. It did not shudder with the impact of distant ruin. It was magnificently, stubbornly still. Some men simply fell to their knees the moment their boots touched the paving stones. They did not do this in a grand display of dramatic prayer. They just wanted to press their open palms against the cold, hard reality of the earth. They wanted to feel the unyielding foundation of their home. They patted the cobblestones as if greeting an old, beloved friend. But they were not alone on the docks. Through the lingering morning mist, figures began to emerge, moving toward them with a hurried, gentle grace. They were not generals or military commanders. They were women. There were mothers, sisters, and grandmothers who had traveled down from the towns and villages, guided by the same quiet call that had sent the little ships out to sea. They wore simple, floral aprons over thick woolen skirts. Their hair was tucked neatly beneath knitted scarves. They wore practical, heavy shoes that clicked softly against the stone. To the soldiers, who had spent weeks in a masculine world of mud, metal, and profound violence, the sight of these women was the most surreal and beautiful vision of all. They represented the gentle, nurturing heart of the country they had been fighting to protect. The women did not stare at the dirt, or the torn uniforms, or the haunted, hollow looks in the boys' eyes. They moved among the ranks of exhausted men with the practiced, soothing efficiency of mothers tending to a nursery in the middle of the night. In their arms, they carried towering stacks of thick, heavy wool blankets. As a shivering soldier stepped away from the water's edge, a woman would step seamlessly into his path. Without a word of questioning, she would unfold the blanket, smelling faintly of lavender and the warm, dry air of a hallway airing cupboard, and drape it firmly over his shoulders. She would reach around to the front, her hands brushing against his soot-stained lapels, and pull the edges of the wool tightly together across his chest. "There you are, love," a soft, musical voice would murmur, carrying the comforting lilt of a local accent. "You're safe now. You're right as rain." The weight of the blanket was a physical embrace. It trapped the shivering heat of their bodies, driving the deep, biting cold of the channel from their bones. But even more warming than the wool was the tender, maternal touch of the women's hands. For boys who had felt so terribly small and abandoned under the open sky of the beach, being fussed over and tucked in by a stranger was a profound restoration of their humanity. And then, carried on large wooden trays, came the ultimate symbol of British solace. Mugs of sweet, steaming tea. They were poured into thick, chipped enamel cups, the metal instantly warming the numb, trembling fingers that reached out to take them. The tea was brewed incredibly strong, the water boiled on portable stoves set up right there on the paving stones of the pier. It was mixed with generous, heavy pours of milk and stirred with heaping spoonfuls of precious sugar. A soldier would cup the warm tin in both hands, bringing it slowly to his face. He would close his eyes, letting the fragrant steam wash over his salt-crusted cheeks. He would take a small, hesitant sip. It was a taste of pure, distilled life. The scalding, sugary sweetness coated throats that had been raw with thirst and the dry dust of the French roads. It sent a bright, golden line of heat straight down into their empty stomachs. It tasted like Sunday afternoons in the parlor. It tasted like the quiet mornings sitting at the kitchen table while the radio played softly in the background. It tasted exactly, perfectly, like home. They sat on overturned wooden shipping crates, on coils of thick harbor rope, or simply cross-legged on the stone pier, wrapped in their gray and brown blankets, cradling their mugs of tea like fragile treasures. They did not speak much. The relief was too vast, too heavy for words. Instead, they retreated into the quiet, beautiful architecture of their own minds. A young husband, leaning his head against the brick wall of a harbor warehouse, closed his eyes and sent a silent letter flying across the English countryside. "My darling," he thought, the warmth of the tea spreading through his chest. "I am sitting on the dock. The cliffs are so white they hurt my eyes. There is a woman here who reminds me of your mother, and she has given me a blanket. I am drinking tea, and I am breathing the same air as you. Put the kettle on, my love. I am finally on my way to your door." The women moved continuously through the seated crowd, carrying battered aluminum kettles, gently topping up the mugs. They offered quiet, soothing reassurances, treating the men not as triumphant heroes or defeated soldiers, but simply as exhausted children who had been caught in a terrible storm and needed to be warmed by the fire. "Drink it all down, sweetheart," a gray-haired woman whispered, gently touching the shoulder of a boy who was staring blankly at the green water of the harbor. "There's plenty more. You just rest now. The walking is over." The boy looked up at her, his eyes welling with fresh tears. He managed a small, trembling smile, a fragile blooming of hope on his dust-covered face. He nodded, taking another slow sip of the sweet, warm tea. As the morning wore on, the sun climbed higher, casting a warm, golden light over the harbor. The white cliffs of Dover stood brilliantly against the blue sky, watching over the scene with a silent, ancient grace. The docks were a sprawling mosaic of wool blankets, rising steam, and profound, quiet peace. The nightmare of the sprawling sands, the terror of the falling sky, and the freezing, desperate wade into the dark channel were finally behind them. They were enveloped in the soft voices of the women, the comforting weight of the wool, and the sweet, lingering taste of the tea. They were entirely, beautifully safe. And as they sat in the morning sun, feeling the gentle warmth return to their bodies and their souls, they knew that they had survived the longest night of their lives, and had awakened in the gentle, waiting arms of home. To truly leave the dark waters behind, they had to be gathered up and carried inland upon the gentle, rhythmic heartbeat of the iron road. The transition from the salt-sprayed docks to the cavernous, echoing halls of the railway stations was a journey from the edge of the world back into its very center. The great steam locomotives stood waiting at the platforms, panting softly in the morning air. They were magnificent, gleaming machines, breathing thick plumes of white steam that curled beautifully against the iron rafters of the station roof. The sound they made was not the terrifying, mechanical whine of the sky they had so recently escaped. It was a domestic, comforting hiss. It was the sound of holidays, of weekend visits to the country, of the deep, reliable infrastructure of a nation that was entirely intact. The men shuffled toward the open carriage doors, their boots dragging heavily on the smooth concrete. They were still wrapped in the thick wool blankets given to them by the women on the pier, looking more like a procession of weary ghosts than an army. But as they stepped up into the carriages, the world transformed once again. They sank into the seats, and a collective, almost silent gasp of relief filled the compartments. After weeks of sleeping on the hard, rutted earth of French fields, of pressing their faces into the sharp, glass-like sand of the dunes, and of lying on the unyielding, wet wooden floorboards of the little ships, the sensation of the train cushions was overwhelmingly luxurious. Whether it was the slightly worn, plush velvet of a first-class carriage or the sturdy, familiar patterned fabric of the standard compartments, it felt like sinking into a cloud. The air inside smelled of polished mahogany, old pipe tobacco, and the faint, dusty scent of peacetime travel. With a long, blowing whistle that echoed like a gentle call to the countryside, the train slowly lurched forward. It began with a subtle tug, a heavy, pulling motion that settled the men deeper into their seats. And then, the rhythm began. Clack, 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 clack. The heavy iron wheels rolled over the seams of the tracks, picking up a steady, hypnotic cadence. It was a metronome of absolute safety, measuring out the miles between the nightmare of the coast and the warm hearths of their homes. As the train gathered speed, the carriages began to sway. It was a gentle, side-to-side rocking motion, entirely different from the unpredictable, stomach-churning swells of the English Channel. This was a guided, purposeful sway, a cradle moving along a predetermined path. The rhythmic vibration traveled up through the floorboards, through the soft cushions, and into the aching bones of the soldiers. It was a physical lullaby, massaging the deep, lingering tension from their calves and their shoulders. Heads began to loll against the cool glass of the windows. Shoulders slumped against neighbors. The men surrendered to the slumber of the rails. They slept with their faces turned toward the sunlight streaming through the glass, letting the warmth wash over their pale, exhausted features. The quiet camaraderie of the long retreat remained. They slept in tangled piles, a hand resting on a knee, a head pillowed on a stranger's shoulder. They were safe, and they were moving forward without having to take a single footstep. For those who could not yet sleep, who were too wired by the adrenaline of the past weeks to close their eyes, the windows offered a profound and healing cinema. They pulled down the leather straps, lowering the heavy glass panes, and let the rush of sweet, inland air fill the compartment. They rested their chins on their folded arms, gazing out at the English. countryside rolling by in a vibrant, unbroken tapestry of green. It was a shock to the senses. The landscape of northern France had been drained of color, painted in the gray ash of ruin and the pale dust of the retreating march. But here, the world was bursting with life. They watched the lush, emerald fields of grazing cattle pass in a blur. They saw the intricate patchwork of ancient stone walls, the blooming white hawthorn hedges, and the dark, quiet woods that held no hidden dangers, only the songs of thrushes and blackbirds. They passed through sleepy, undisturbed villages where the most dramatic structure was a moss-covered church spire pointing peacefully toward a clear, blue sky. It was a world that had not been torn open. A world where the earth was still used for planting, not for hiding. A young corporal, his uniform still stiff with the salt of the sea, stared out at a passing meadow. In the quiet sanctuary of his mind, he reached for his wife, composing a letter he would whisper to her when he finally walked through their front door. "My darling," he thought, watching a flock of birds rise from a field. "The grass here is so impossibly green. I had forgotten what color looked like. I am on the train, and we are passing houses with their windows entirely intact, with washing hanging on the lines, dancing in the breeze. It is so quiet. I am letting the sound of the wheels carry me back to you. I am coming back to our gentle life." As the trains pushed deeper into the heart of the country, moving away from the coast, word of their arrival began to travel ahead of them, moving faster than the steam engines themselves. When the trains approached the small, rural junctions and the wooden gates of the level crossings, the drivers would gently ease off the steam. The locomotives would slow to a crawling, majestic pace, the clack-clack of the wheels stretching out into a long, drawn-out sigh. And there, waiting by the side of the tracks, were the people. They had not gathered with brass bands or grand, patriotic banners. There were no formal speeches prepared. It was simply the villagers, the women from the local farms, the old men with walking sticks, the children let out of school, the bakers, the postman, and the vicar. They stood closely together, lining the grassy banks and the wooden platforms, their faces turned upward toward the open windows of the train. As the carriages glided past, a beautiful, frantic ballet of gratitude and kindness began. The people on the platforms reached into wicker baskets and canvas bags, pulling out whatever small treasures they had been able to gather from their pantries and their gardens. Through the open windows of the train, gifts began to rain down upon the laps of the astonished soldiers. Apples, crisp and bright red, were tossed gently through the air, caught by eager, soot-stained hands. Loaves of bread, still warm from the oven, were passed up. Packets of cigarettes, precious and carefully hoarded, were handed to reaching fingers. Folded copies of the local newspaper were thrown aboard, a desperately craved tether to the ordinary events of the world. A young girl, wearing a simple cotton dress and a ribbon in her hair, ran alongside the slow-moving carriage. In her small hands, she carried a bouquet of wild daisies she had just picked from the meadow. She reached up, stretching as tall as she could, her bright eyes meeting the hollow, exhausted gaze of a soldier leaning out the window. He reached down, his heavy, dirt-caked hand gently taking the delicate flowers from her fingers. "Thank you, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice cracking. He pulled the daisies to his chest, burying his face in their soft, fragrant petals. They smelled of earth, and sunshine, and absolute innocence. In that single, quiet moment, surrounded by the sweet scent of the flowers and the gentle, smiling face of the child, the thick, psychological armor the soldier had built around his heart simply shattered. He had not cried when the sky was falling. He had not wept during the agonizing march through the dust, or during the freezing, terrifying wade into the dark channel. He had held his emotions tightly in a locked box, knowing that to feel the sorrow was to risk breaking apart entirely. But here, faced with the pure, uncomplicated kindness of a stranger handing him a wildflower, the box unlocked. He leaned back into the plush seat of the carriage, holding the daisies tightly, and he began to weep. They were quiet, cleansing tears, washing away the last remnants of the war's terrible grip on his soul. All down the train, this quiet melting of hardened shells was taking place. Men who had survived the unimaginable were breaking down over the crisp snap of a fresh apple or the taste of a sweet, buttered sandwich made by a woman they would never meet. The sheer normalcy of the food, the bright colors of the flowers, and the loving, relieved smiles of the villagers were a beautiful, overwhelming shock to their systems. They realized, perhaps for the first time since they had stepped off the beaches, that they were not just safe, they were cherished. They had felt so small and forgotten on the sprawling sands, but here, rolling through the heart of the country, they were reminded that every single one of their lives was a precious, celebrated thing. The villagers waved until the very last carriage disappeared around the bend, their arms raised high, their own eyes shining with tears. Inside the train, the soldiers settled back down. They polished the apples on the sleeves of their coats. They tucked the wild daisies into the buttonholes of their ruined tunics. They shared the bread, breaking it apart and passing it around the compartment, a holy communion of survival and homecoming. As the locomotive picked up speed once more, resuming its rhythmic, lulling journey through the valleys and over the stone bridges, the men closed their eyes again. But the sleep they found now was different. It was no longer the heavy, blank slumber of pure exhaustion. It was a lighter, sweeter rest, colored by the taste of apples and the scent of flowers. They were cocooned in the soft upholstery, rocked gently by the iron rails, and wrapped securely in the profound, enduring love of the people who had lined the tracks to welcome them back from the dark. The slumber on the rails carried them onward, a gentle, sweeping tide of peace, bringing the broken boys ever closer to the quiet, waiting warmth of their own front doors. While the trains carried the boys through the sunlit valleys, a very different kind of journey was taking place in the quiet sitting rooms of home. In the hushed, suspended hours of the late afternoon, time did not move in a straight line. It pooled in the corners of the living rooms, thick and heavy, measured only by the slow, rhythmic ticking of a mantel clock or the soft scratching of a dog turning in its basket. Across the country, the world had narrowed down to the space of a front parlor, the view from a bay window, and the glowing, amber dial of the wireless radio. The families who waited were fighting a war of profound and absolute stillness. They could not march, they could not sail, and they could not reach through the ether to pull their boys from the dark water. They could only sit in the quiet sanctuaries of their homes, holding their breath, keeping the fires warm and the lamps lit against the gathering dusk. A mother sat in a floral armchair, a half-finished woolen sock resting in her lap. Her knitting needles, usually a blur of comforting, rhythmic silver, lay perfectly still. Her eyes were fixed on the small, wooden cabinet of the radio. The voice that floated from the speaker was calm, measured, and carefully stripped of panic, speaking in gentle tones of a great movement across the channel, of little ships and sandy shores. But a mother hears the truth beneath the words. She hears the freezing surf. She hears the terrifying, open sky. To anchor herself against the rising tide of her own quiet terror, she reached into the pocket of her cardigan. Her fingers traced the familiar, softened edges of a folded piece of paper. It was a letter, written weeks ago in the deceptive calm of the French spring. She knew the words by heart, but she unfolded it anyway, smoothing the creases over her knee. The weather is uncommonly fine, the faded pencil read. I am eating wonderfully. Do not worry for me, Mother, I am perfectly safe. She traced her son's handwriting, feeling the slight indentations where he had pressed the pencil firmly into the paper. It was a physical connection, a tiny bridge built of graphite and love, stretching across the impossible distance. She closed her eyes and visualized him walking down their quiet lane, his hands in his pockets, whistling a tune he had heard at the cinema. She built a protective wall of these gentle memories, a fortress of ordinary days, to keep the shadows of the unknown at bay. In another house, at the end of a cobblestone street, a young wife stood by the kitchen sink, her hands plunged into warm, soapy water. She was washing the same 2 teacups over and over again, needing the simple, grounding sensation of the warm water and the smooth porcelain to keep her hands from trembling. She looked out the window, watching the wind rustle the leaves of the climbing rose bush they had planted together on their first anniversary. Every time a car turned onto her street, every time the neighbor's dog barked, her heart would leap violently into her throat. She would freeze, the soapy water dripping slowly from her fingertips, listening with an intensity that made her ears ache. Is it him? The silence seemed to whisper. Is it his footstep on the pavement? When the sound faded, revealing itself to be nothing but the wind or the grocer's delivery boy, she would close her eyes, exhale a long, shuddering breath, and gently lower the teacup back into the water. The waiting was an exhausting, emotional tide, rushing in with a sudden, breathless hope, and receding into a deep, hollow ache. But then, as the late afternoon shadows lengthened and the golden light of evening began to filter through the lace curtains, the miracles began to arrive. They did not announce themselves with a trumpet or a parade. They came in the most ordinary, heartbreakingly beautiful ways. For the young wife by the window, the miracle began with the familiar, protesting squeak of the rusted iron gate at the front of her garden. It was a sound she had heard 1,000 times, a sound she had complained about just last summer, but now, it was the most magnificent symphony in the world. She dropped the teacup into the water. She did not bother to dry her hands. She ran through the narrow hallway, her footsteps echoing on the wooden floorboards, her breath catching so sharply in her chest that she could barely make a sound. She reached the heavy oak door and pulled it open, the sudden rush of evening air sweeping into the house. And there he was. He was standing on the porch, illuminated by the soft glow of the street lamp. His uniform was unrecognizable, stiff with dried seawater, stained with the gray dust of the dunes and the dark soot of the retreat. He looked thinner, his face hollowed by exhaustion, his eyes carrying the profound, heavy weight of things he would never speak of. He was trembling, shifting his weight awkwardly, as if he could not quite believe that the door in front of him was real. "I'm home," he whispered, his voice cracked and entirely broken. There were no words left in the world to answer him. She simply stepped across the threshold and threw herself into his arms. The impact of their embrace was a physical grounding, two halves of a fractured world crashing back together. She buried her face in the rough, filthy wool of his coat. He smelled of diesel oil, of old canvas, of sea salt, and of the smoke of a burning continent. But beneath it all, he smelled like him. He smelled like her husband. He wrapped his heavy, exhausted arms around her, burying his face in her hair, and he finally, completely, let go. His knees buckled slightly, but she held him up. She held him with a fierce, protective strength, absorbing his sobs into her own shoulder. They stood there on the porch for a long, timeless moment, crying quietly into the twilight, anchored entirely by the miraculous, undeniable warmth of each other's beating hearts. "Come inside," she finally murmured, gently pulling him toward the light of the hallway. "I'll put the kettle on." Down the street, in the parlor with the ticking clock, the mother was still sitting in her chair when the heavy, brass knocker struck the front door. 3 sharp, distinct taps. She stood up so quickly her knitting fell to the floor, the ball of yarn rolling softly under the sofa. She walked to the door as if moving through water, her hand shaking violently as she reached for the brass handle. When she opened it, her boy was standing there. He had lost his cap, his hair was a tangled mess of salt and sand, and he was clutching a single, wilted wildflower he had been given on the train. He looked at her, his eyes wide and vulnerable, stripped of all the bravado of the day he had left. He was not a soldier returning from the front, he was simply a boy who had been very lost in the dark, and who had finally found his way back to his mother's porch. "Hello, Mom," he said softly. She reached up, her soft, trembling hands cupping his face, her thumbs gently brushing the dust from his cheekbones. "My beautiful boy," she whispered, pulling him down to press a kiss to his forehead. "My beautiful, brave boy. You're safe. Come in, let me wash your face." These were the echoes of pure, unadulterated joy. They filled the hallways with the sounds of running water, of kettles boiling, of low, soothing voices speaking in the comforting rhythms of a restored life. The empty rooms were filled once more with the heavy, reassuring thud of boots on the stairs, and the profound, peaceful silence of a soldier finally sleeping in his own bed. But as the evening deepened into night, wrapping the island in a velvet darkness, a different kind of quiet settled over the homes where the knock never came. The poignant reality of the rescue was that the sea, though vast and forgiving, could not carry everyone. For some sitting rooms, the waiting did not end with a sudden embrace on the porch. The waiting simply stretched out, thinning and fading, until it slowly transformed into a quiet, enduring shadow. The realization rarely arrived all at once. It was a slow, agonizing settling of the dust. It was the postman walking slowly up the garden path a few days later, his steps heavy, avoiding the eyes of the father standing in the doorway. It was the delivery of a telegram, a small, pale yellow envelope that felt impossibly cold to the touch. Or, perhaps most terribly, it was just the silence. The days turning into weeks, the wireless moving on to other news, and the front gate remaining stubbornly, painfully still. In these homes, the empty rooms became sanctuaries of a different kind. They became places of profound, quiet mourning. There was no grand, theatrical wailing. The sorrow of the island was held closely to the chest, a private, dignified ache that seeped into the very wallpaper. A father would walk into his son's empty bedroom. He would not turn on the light. He would simply stand in the doorway, looking at the perfectly made bed, the cricket bat standing in the corner, the model airplanes gathering a fine layer of dust on the shelf. He would reach out, his rough hand gently touching the wooden frame of the door, offering a silent, heartbreaking salute to the boy who had grown up in that room, the boy who was now sleeping forever in the foreign sand. A mother would take the letters she had kept in her pocket, the one speaking of the fine weather and the peaceful spring. She would not throw them away. She would place them delicately into a cedar box, wrapping them in a silk ribbon, treating them as holy relics of a life cut beautifully, tragically short. She would close the lid, locking the innocence of the phony war safely away, and she would sit in her armchair, looking at the empty space by the fire where he used to sit. The morning was not a sudden storm, it was a slow, gentle rain that watered the roots of their resilience. They understood, with a quiet, breathtaking grace, that their boys had not simply vanished. They had become part of the great, invisible shield that was holding the dark at bay. They thought of the sprawling beaches, now empty and peaceful under the rolling waves. They thought of the dunes where their sons had lay, the spring grass where they had stood their ground, and the freezing water they had waded into. They did not see their boys as victims of the shore, they saw them as the quiet, enduring heroes of the tide. Their boys had given their tomorrows so that the neighbor's son could knock on his door, so that the trains could roll safely through the valleys, so that the island could continue to breathe. In the twilight, a mother would walk out into her garden. She would kneel in the damp earth, near the rose bush, and she would press her hands into the soil. She would plant a new seed, a small, defiant act of life in the face of profound loss. "I am still here," her actions whispered to the fading light. "You are gone, but the love you left behind is still growing. I will keep the garden beautiful for you. I will keep the light on in the hall." This was the ultimate, everyday heroism of the home front. The quiet acceptance of an empty chair. The courage to wake up in a house that felt too large, to make a cup of tea, and to carry the memory of a fallen boy through the ordinary motions of a Tuesday morning. As the night finally claimed the sky, the island settled into a collective, complicated peace. In some rooms, there was the heavy, rhythmic breathing of a rescued son, asleep at last under a familiar quilt. In other rooms, there was only the ticking of the clock, keeping time for a ghost. But across the cobblestone streets and the country lanes, a shared, invisible thread connected every home. It was the thread of a profound, enduring love. A love that had reached out across the dark water, pulling the little ships toward the fire. A love that had waited patiently by the glowing radio dials. And a love that would continue to echo softly, gently, and eternally through the quiet, empty rooms of a nation that would never, ever forget. When the last wooden boat finally slipped away into the mist, the great, sprawling beach simply exhaled and surrendered to the silence. For so many days and nights, this long stretch of pale sand had been the very center of the universe. It had held the desperate hopes of a retreating world. It had felt the heavy, exhausted tread of thousands of boots, the frantic digging of bare hands seeking shelter, and the collective, shuddering breath of boys waiting in the dark. It had been a place of terrifying noise, a landscape torn open by the unnatural storms of a fractured continent. But now, as the morning sun began to rise over the dunes, painting the sky in soft strokes of peach and lavender, the beach was entirely, beautifully empty. The chaos had washed away, leaving behind a profound and absolute stillness. The only sound was the ancient, gentle breathing of the earth itself. It was the soft rustle of the stiff green marram grass, bending low and swaying in the cool sea breeze. It was the distant, lonely cry of a white gull circling lazily in the clearing sky. And, above all, it was the rhythmic, eternal lullaby of the English Channel, rising and falling, rolling slowly onto the shore. The ocean did not know that history had just been written upon its edges. The sea cares nothing for the arbitrary borders of men, or the rise and fall of nations. It only knows the quiet, faithful pull of the moon. And so, with a gentle, indifferent grace, the tide began to come in. It crept up the sloping sands, a thin, shimmering sheet of cold water and white foam. It reached the places where the boys had huddled together for warmth. It flowed into the shallow depressions they had scooped out with their helmets. With every gentle wave that broke against the shore, the water acted like a soothing hand, slowly and meticulously smoothing out the wrinkled, scarred bedsheets of the coast. The millions of overlapping footprints, the frantic scuffles, the heavy, dragging steps of the exhausted, the deep impressions left by men carrying their wounded brothers, were softly filled with water. The sharp edges of the boot prints dissolved. The sand shifted and settled, turning over in the quiet current. One by one, the physical marks of the Great Retreat were simply washed away, carried out into the deep, returning the beach to a pristine, untouched canvas. Left behind in the dunes and the shallows were the heavy things the men could not carry across the water. The beach was scattered with the silent artifacts of survival. A heavy canvas pack, sitting quietly in the seagrass. A dented tin canteen, half buried in the wet sand, its carrying strap swaying gently in the rising tide. A heavy steel helmet, resting upside down, slowly filling with rainwater and salt. These were not just discarded objects, they were the shed shells of a terrible season. They were the heavy armor the boys had to leave behind in order to become light enough to float away. In the quiet morning, these scattered things looked peaceful, entirely stripped of their purpose. They belonged to the earth now. The sand would slowly cover them, the sea salt would soften their edges, and the gentle march of time would turn them into rust and memory. If you walked along the water's edge in that profound quiet, you might find the most delicate, heartbreaking treasures left behind by the departing tide. A small, stubby pencil, dropped by a trembling hand in the dark. A torn half of a playing card, the remnants of a quiet game played in the shadow of a sand dune to keep the fear at bay. Perhaps even a page from a small notebook, its edges fluttering in the wind, the graphite words blurred by the sea mist, carrying a message of love that had already been delivered in the hearts of those who sailed away. These tiny, fragile monuments whispered the true story of the shore. They spoke of the quiet, everyday heroism of simply holding on. They remembered the shared sips of lukewarm water, the gentle hands that had bandaged the broken, and the profound, unspoken brotherhood forged in the freezing surf. The fear that had gripped this place was completely gone, evaporated into the vast blue sky. Only the love remained, lingering like a sweet perfume in the salt air. As the sun climbed higher, warming the pale sand, the light touched the crumbling edges of the old stone breakwaters and the narrow wooden piers. They stood like quiet sentinels in the water, their timber scarred and groaning softly in the swells. They had borne the weight of an entire generation walking upon the water, suspended between the fire and the deep. Now, they were resting. The long, agonizing lines of men balancing in the dark were gone. The reaching hands of the civilian sailors pulling strangers from the cold waves had retreated into the mist. But the memory of those reaching hands is permanently woven into the fabric of the water. The English Channel will forever hold the echo of those small, stuttering wooden engines. The river cruisers, the fishing smacks, and the little sailing yachts had come and gone like a flock of miraculous, gentle birds. They had sailed into the mouth of the nightmare armed with nothing but thick wool blankets, thermoses of sweet tea, and an unbreakable devotion to their fellow man. Their courage was not the roaring, destructive power of the storm, it was the quiet, enduring light of a lantern held steady in the dark. They proved that when the world breaks apart, humanity's first, deepest instinct is to row out into the deepest water and gather the broken pieces. That profound grace is the true legacy of the sprawling sands. It is a monument built not of marble or bronze, but of pure, selfless compassion. And then, there is a gentle lullaby to be sung for those who did not sail away. For the men of the rearguard, who stood in the shadows of the old farmhouses and the quiet canals, holding the doors of the continent closed so their brothers could escape. And for the boys who simply grew too tired to take another step, who lay down in the spring grass and surrendered their weary bodies to the earth. They are not forgotten ghosts wandering a lonely shore. They are the quiet guardians of the peace. They sleep in the rich, dark soil of the French countryside, under the shade of the chestnut trees and the blooming hawthorn hedges. They rest beneath the rolling, green waves of the deep channel, cradled softly by the currents of the sea. The earth holds them with an infinite, tender care. The rain washes their resting places, the sun warms the grass above them, and the wind sings softly through the dunes in eternal gratitude. They gave the entirety of their tomorrows so that 1,000,000 ordinary todays could simply exist. Their sacrifice is the quiet, unspoken foundation beneath every peaceful morning that followed. As the day gently fades into evening on the empty beach, the sky softens once more. The brilliant blue deepens into a rich, bruised violet, and then settles into the calming, velvet black of a long, undisturbed night. The stars emerge, exactly as they did on those terrifying nights of waiting. But now, they do not look down on a frightened city of men hiding in the dust. They look down on a natural, sleeping world. They reflect brilliantly in the wet sand left behind by the retreating tide, turning the beach into a mirror of the heavens. The air grows cool, carrying the clean, sharp scent of ozone and deep water. The sea continues its endless, rhythmic breathing. S-H-H-H-H, S-H-H-H-H. The waves roll in, breaking softly, sliding up the sand, and slipping back into the dark. It is a sound that smooths the frayed edges of the soul. It is a sound that promises that no matter how terrible the fire, no matter how loud the noise of the world becomes, the quiet will always, eventually, return. The footprints have all been washed away. The heavy boots are gone. The little boats are safely tied to their moorings in the misty harbors of home, rocking gently in the dark. The boys who waited on this shore grew into men, they built homes, they tended gardens, they loved their children, and they carried the memory of the reaching hands with them all the days of their lives. And this beach, this vast, beautiful stretch of sand where the land simply ends, is at peace. It holds no anger. It keeps no ledgers of the sorrow. It only offers its wide, sweeping beauty to the sky. If you were to stand there now, at the edge of the water, with the cool wet sand beneath your feet and the wind softly brushing your face, you would not feel the echoes of war. You would only feel the profound, enduring warmth of the human spirit. You would feel the quiet resilience of a mother waiting by a radio. You would feel the gentle touch of a nurse winding a clean white bandage in a candlelit cellar. You would feel the strong, calloused hand of a baker pulling a frightened boy from the freezing surf. The history of this shore is not a story of destruction. It is a beautiful, quiet bedtime story about the light outlasting the dark. It is a testament to the undeniable truth that even in the most terrifying moments of our existence, we are capable of extraordinary, breathless grace. So let the night fall over the dunes. Let the white gulls tuck their heads beneath their wings and sleep. Let the channel roll, and the wind blow, and the stars shine down on the empty, peaceful sand. The walking is over. The boats have all come home. The footprints have been washed by the tide, leaving nothing behind but the clean, sweeping beauty of the shore and the eternal, quiet promise that we will always reach for one another in the dark.